Welcome back. Tonight, we're drifting slowly into the complete lore of Little Nightmares 3, the latest chapter in this haunting franchise where childhood fears manifest as grotesque realities, and the boundaries between imagination and nightmare blur like watercolors in the rain. This entry takes us deeper into the nowhere, that twisted realm where lost children wander through manifestations of trauma, following two new souls as they navigate a place called the Spiral, a cluster of disturbing locations bound together by mirrors and desperation. From the dust-choked ruins of an ancient necropolis to the sterile corridors of a decaying asylum, we'll trace every step of their journey, uncovering the secrets hidden in shadows and the truth behind a friendship that may never have existed at all. Whether you're experiencing these revelations for the first time, letting the familiar unease wash over you like a comforting darkness, or simply allowing the tale to carry you gently towards sleep, this will guide you through every layer of Little Nightmares 3's haunting narrative. Before we begin, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy this kind of slow, immersive storytelling that unfolds like a fever dream. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and whether you've played through the entire game or are discovering this world for the first time. It's always fascinating to see how these stories resonate differently across the world, one quiet night at a time. Let's begin. A new chapter in the franchise. Little Nightmares 3 represents a significant evolution for the franchise, marking the first entry developed by Supermassive Games rather than original creator Tarsier Studios. When Tarsier was acquired by Embracer Group in December 2019, they confirmed that Little Nightmares 2 would be their final contribution to the series. However, since the intellectual property rights belong to Bandai Namco Entertainment, the publisher made the decision to continue the franchise with a new development team. Supermassive Games, known for their work on narrative horror experiences like Until Dawn and The Dark Pictures Anthology, brought their expertise to this project, having previously handled the enhanced PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S ports of Little Nightmares 2. This transition in development teams naturally raised questions about whether the game would maintain the atmospheric dread and environmental storytelling that defined the previous entries. The game was unveiled at Gamescom's Opening Night Live in August 2023, with an initial release window of 2024, generating immediate excitement among fans of the series. However, in May 2024, Bandai Namco announced a delay to 2025, allowing Supermassive additional time to refine their vision. When Little Nightmares 3 finally released on October 10, 2025, it arrived across multiple platforms, including PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, Windows PC, the Nintendo Switch, and the Nintendo Switch 2. The game received mixed reviews from critics and players alike, with Steam reviews showing approximately 49% positive reception and recent reviews trending lower at around 41% positive reception. Critics praised aspects like the atmospheric design and cooperative gameplay innovation, while some criticism focused on various elements of the experience. What sets Little Nightmares 3 apart from its predecessors most dramatically is the introduction of cooperative gameplay as a core element rather than an optional element. For the first time in the franchise's history, players can experience the entire campaign with a friend through online co-op, or tackle it solo with an AI companion. This fundamental shift in design philosophy extends to the game's protagonists as well. Instead of following a single child through their nightmare, we now have two distinct characters, Low and Alone, each with their own unique abilities and tools. Low wields a bow and arrow, allowing him to trigger distant mechanisms and eliminate threats from afar, while Alone carries a wrench that can smash through obstacles and interact with machinery. This dual protagonist approach necessitates genuine cooperation, with puzzles and encounters designed around the interplay between their different skill sets.
The game's narrative structure also represents a departure from previous entries in the series. While Little Nightmares and Little Nightmares 2 told relatively straightforward stories of children escaping from nightmarish locations, Little Nightmares 3 embraces a more psychological horror approach. The developers themselves have described it as a brand new story set in the universe of Little Nightmares, rather than a direct sequel. This means that while the game shares thematic DNA and takes place within the same twisted reality known as the Nowhere, it doesn't directly continue the narratives of Six or Mono from the previous games. New players can jump into Little Nightmares 3 without prior knowledge of the series, though longtime fans will recognize familiar motifs, visual language, and lore elements that connect this entry to the broader mythology. The game takes place within a region of the Nowhere called the Spiral, described as a cluster of disturbing places connected by mirror gateways. This represents an expansion of the series' world-building, introducing a new area with its own rules and aesthetics distinct from the Maw and the Pale City that featured in earlier games. While previous locations in the series were driven by specific concepts, hunger for the Maw and escapism for the Pale City, the Spiral operates on a different principle entirely. According to supplementary materials and fan analysis, the Spiral's driving force appears to be attention, a theme that manifests throughout the game's 4 main chapters in various ways. This thematic foundation informs the design of the locations, the behavior of the monsters, and ultimately the revelation about the true nature of one of our protagonists. Little Nightmares 3 continues the series' tradition of environmental storytelling, where much of the narrative unfolds through careful observation of the world rather than explicit dialogue or cutscenes. The game features no traditional narration or character speech, relying instead on visual cues, ambient sound design, and the grotesque imagery that has become the franchise's hallmark. Every location tells a story through its architecture, its inhabitants, and the way these elements interact with Low and Alone as they progress through their journey. The developers at Supermassive Games worked to maintain this distinctive approach while adding their own flourishes, creating environments that feel both familiar to series veterans and fresh enough to justify the new development team's involvement. The game's release was accompanied by tie-in media designed to expand the lore of the Little Nightmares universe. A podcast series titled The Sounds of Nightmares released its first episodes on Bandai Namco Europe's YouTube channel in August 2023, featuring audio drama that explores the Nowhere through different perspectives. The 4th chapter of this podcast series specifically focuses on locations that appear in Little Nightmares 3, including the Spiral and the Carnevale.
Additionally, a novel called The Lonely Ones provides further context for some of the game's locations and characters, though crucially, the developers have stated that these supplementary materials are not required to understand the main game. Little Nightmares 3 was designed to be accessible on its own terms, with the extended media serving to enrich the experience for those who wish to dive deeper rather than gatekeeping essential narrative information. One of the most significant additions to the game is the Friend Pass feature, which allows players to invite someone to join them in online co-op without that person needing to own the game themselves. This accessibility feature acknowledges that the cooperative experience is central to the game's design and ensures that more players can experience Little Nightmares 3 as intended. However, it's worth noting that the game does not support cross-platform play between different console families and cross-generation play between PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, or Xbox One and Xbox Series S or X is also not available at launch. Each save file gives players the option to choose which protagonist they want to control, meaning you're not permanently locked into playing as Lo or alone across different playthroughs.
The visual presentation of Little Nightmares 3 maintains the series' signature aesthetic, a blend of dark whimsy and body horror that creates an atmosphere of constant unease. The game employs a 2.5D perspective, where players navigate three-dimensional environments along predominantly fixed paths, with the camera occasionally pulling back to reveal the full scope of a location, or zooming in to emphasize claustrophobic moments. This approach allows the developers to craft carefully composed shots that highlight the grotesque scale of the world, emphasizing how small and vulnerable Lo and Alone are compared to the monstrous residents who inhabit these spaces. The art direction leans heavily into exaggerated proportions and distorted anatomy, transforming everyday objects and human forms into twisted approximations that feel wrong in ways that bypass rational analysis and strike directly at primal fears. The game's structure consists of 4 main chapters, each representing a distinct location within the spiral. The Necropolis serves as the opening chapter, introducing players to the core mechanics and cooperative gameplay. The Candy Factory follows, featuring stealth sequences and the terrifying Supervisor. The Carnevale represents the longest and most elaborate chapter in the game, approximately doubling the length of the other chapters, and introducing multiple antagonists, including the Kin and Mini-Kin. Finally, the Institute serves as the climactic chapter, bringing together the narrative threads of the game and delivering revelations about Lo's past that recontextualize the journey. Each chapter features hidden collectibles in the form of dolls, with 5 in the Necropolis, 5 in the Candy Factory, 10 in the Carnevale, and 5 in the Institute. The Carnevale chapter also includes an additional collectible type, 10 geisha statues that reference the lady from the first Little Nightmares game. The game's reception has been mixed, with critics praising aspects like the atmospheric environments, sound design, and the innovation of cooperative gameplay, while expressing concerns about pacing, puzzle design, and certain narrative choices. Some longtime fans felt that the shift to cooperative gameplay diminished the feeling of isolation that characterized earlier entries, while others appreciated the fresh approach and the way it opened up new puzzle design possibilities. The revelation about Alone's true nature divided players, with some finding it a poignant exploration of childhood trauma and coping mechanisms, while others felt it undercut the emotional weight of the journey. These varying reactions speak to the challenge of evolving an established franchise while maintaining what made it special in the first place. Looking forward, Bandai Namco has announced an expansion pass titled Secrets of the Spiral, which will add 2 additional chapters to the game, bringing the total chapter count to 6. While specific release dates remain unconfirmed, the expansion promises to explore new areas of the spiral, introduce fresh horrors, and potentially provide additional context for the events of the main game. The expansion will be available separately or as a part of the deluxe edition, which also includes cosmetic costume sets. The deluxe edition includes a ferryman costume set, alongside other costume packs, and pre-orders provided access to the Dark 6 costume set, featuring looks for both Lo and Alone, styled after the girl who escaped the mall. This post-launch support indicates Bandai Namco's commitment to the franchise and suggests that Little Nightmares 3, despite its mixed reception, has found an audience willing to return to the nowhere for more nightmares.
Accessing the nowhere requires passing through a liminal space known as the threshold, the border between the waking world and this realm of nightmares. According to lore established in the Sounds of Nightmares podcast series, traveling to the nowhere begins with dreams, specifically the dreams of children who carry particular kinds of psychological burdens. In the threshold, there exists a door with no doorknob, and beyond this door lies the passage into the nowhere itself. However, this door is not freely accessible. It is guarded by a figure known as the Ferryman, a mysterious entity who serves as a gatekeeper, determining who may cross over and who must remain in the waking world. When the ferryman permits passage, he guides the traveler through the threshold, through the doorway, where they will witness a sight that has haunted many who venture this path. A vast space filled with stairs stretching into infinity, and at its center, a giant pulsing red eye the size of a moon, circled by countless blinking eyes of every conceivable shape and size, each one watching, always watching. This red eye is heavily implied to be the nowhere itself, the physical manifestation of the realm's consciousness. Evidence from the Resident's downloadable content for the first Little Nightmares game supports this interpretation. In the library of the Residents, players can find a globe shaped like a single giant fleshy eye, suggesting that the entire world is essentially one massive living eye. All the smaller eyes circling the great red eye appear to be connected to it, extensions of its consciousness that maintain individual agency while remaining tethered to the central awareness. These eyes can create environments within the nowhere, manifesting locations and scenarios that reflect the fears and memories of the children who enter. The mall and the tower, locations from other Little Nightmares media, openly demonstrate their ability to create and manipulate their own internal environments, manifesting anything they desire or anything the children trapped within them might want, while simultaneously being capable of dismantling those same creations on a whim. The eyes also emit a unique form of light that pervades the nowhere,
a luminescence that affects both the grotesque residents who inhabit this realm and the human children who find themselves trapped within it. This light possesses hypnotic properties, capable of entrancing those who gaze upon it, though interestingly, many children seem naturally resistant to these effects. This suggests that there may be specific criteria that determine who can resist the light's influence, perhaps related to the psychological state or the nature of the trauma that brought them to the nowhere in the first place. When this light shines with particular intensity, it can approach the searing brightness of a sun, causing intense pain to anyone who looks directly at it. The ever-present surveillance of these eyes, their ability to manifest anywhere within the nowhere, watching from behind everyday objects and architectural features, contributes to the constant sense of being observed that permeates every location in the series. Within the larger structure of the nowhere, different regions appear to operate according to distinct principles or driving forces. The Maw, the setting of the first Little Nightmares game, is dominated by insatiable hunger, an all-consuming appetite that transforms both the location's residents and anyone who stays too long into creatures driven purely by the need to feed. The Pale City from Little Nightmares 2 operates under the principle of escapism, with residents entranced by televisions broadcasting hypnotic signals from the signal tower, preferring the comforting lies of the screen to the harsh reality of their existence. Each of these locations within the nowhere manifests as a complete environment with its own internal logic. Yet they remain connected to the broader realm through means not immediately apparent to those trapped within them.
The spiral, the primary setting of Little Nightmares 3, represents another distinct region within the nowhere, described in official materials as a cluster of disturbing places. Unlike the single cohesive locations of previous games, the spiral is explicitly presented as a network of connected areas, bound together by mirror gateways that serve as portals between different nightmare spaces. This fragmented nature reflects the spiral's driving principle, which analysis and supplementary materials suggest is attention. Each location within the spiral seems designed to capture and hold attention in different ways, from the overwhelming visual spectacle of the Carnevale to the clinical observation of the Institute. The spiral appears more overtly constructed as a series of spaces designed around psychological concepts rather than physical geography, suggesting it may be more directly tied to the manifestation of a specific individual psyche than previous locations in the series. Mirrors play a crucial role in Little Nightmares 3, functioning as the primary means of travel between different areas of the spiral. This represents an evolution of a motif that has appeared throughout the franchise. In the first Little Nightmares game, mirrors were notably scarce on the Maw, having been destroyed by the Lady, the location's primary antagonist. The Lady's fear of mirrors ultimately proved her undoing when Six used a handheld mirror against her, suggesting that mirrors possess some inherent power or reveal something about the Nowhere's residents that they wish to keep hidden. In Little Nightmares 2, televisions served a similar transportation function for Mono, allowing him to travel between locations in the Pale City by passing through the screens. Little Nightmares 3 establishes mirrors as Lowe's method of traversal, and, crucially, each time Alone emerges from a mirror after Lowe pulls her through, the mirror shatters, unable to contain her fully. This shattering carries significant implications for understanding Alone's nature.
Throughout their journey, Lo and Alone discover mirrors that lead to new locations within the spiral, and in each instance, Lo enters the mirror first before reaching back to pull Alone through. The fact that mirrors break specifically when Alone passes through them suggests something fundamental about her existence. She is bound to the nowhere in a way that Lo is not, unable to exist in certain spaces or states without causing disruption to the boundaries between realms. This becomes particularly important at the game's conclusion, when Lo attempts to use the final mirror to escape the nowhere entirely. He passes through successfully, reaching what appears to be the real world, but when he tries to pull Alone through with him, she is violently ejected back into the nowhere as the mirror shatters completely, leaving Lo stranded on the other side, cut off from his companion. The areas within the spiral that Lo and Alone visit all show evidence of being lived-in spaces, with beds and personal belongings scattered throughout, suggesting that Lo is not the first child to use mirrors for travel within the nowhere. Other children have discovered this ability and used it to move between nightmares, leaving traces of their presence behind. This detail implies that the mirror travel ability may not be unique to Lo, but rather a property of the spiral itself, or perhaps a capability that certain children within the nowhere naturally develop. However, Lo appears to have a particularly strong connection to this power, able to see through mirrors to glimpse other locations and instinctively understand how to activate their portal properties. The spiral's locations all carry strong connections to childhood experiences, fears, and institutions. The Necropolis, despite its ancient appearance, contains toys and child-sized spaces hidden among the ruins. The Carnevale transforms play and entertainment into performances of forced joy and concealed violence. The Institute explicitly reveals itself as a psychiatric facility for children, complete with toy trains, lollipops, and spelling blocks arranged in patterns that suggest learning spaces corrupted by something darker. This deliberate focus on childhood spaces and fears reinforces the psychological nature of the spiral, marking it as a place that specifically manifests and amplifies the traumas of young people.
Between each chapter of Little Nightmares 3, Lo experiences flashback sequences that show him in a sterile room, hiding from a shadow that appears outside the door. These interludes initially seem like simple transitions, moments of respite between the intense horror of each chapter. However, as the game progresses, these flashbacks reveal more detail, showing Lo trying to hide his drawings in a chute, clutching a doll that bears a striking resemblance to Alone, and desperately avoiding the attention of whoever or whatever lurks beyond that locked door. These sequences eventually reveal themselves to be memories from the Institute, the final chapter's location. They suggest that Lo's entire journey through the spiral may be taking place within his own mind, a psychological landscape constructed from his experiences and traumas during his time in that facility. This interpretation receives further support from the dreamlike quality of the spiral's locations. The Necropolis features monsters with doll-like and porcelain appearances. The candy factory's workers move in hypnotized states, mindlessly performing repetitive tasks. The Carnevale's puppets come alive in ways that defy physical logic. The Institute itself transforms through the power of a special doll that Lo recovers, its rooms shifting between ruined and pristine states as if memory is overlaying reality.
These elements suggest that the version of the nowhere that Lo experiences in the spiral is uniquely personal, shaped by his specific fears, memories, and psychological state. The locations he visits may be manifestations of his childhood experiences, distorted through the lens of trauma into nightmare versions of places and concepts he once knew. The Eye's presence throughout Little Nightmares 3 maintains the connection to the broader mythology of the nowhere. The monster baby in the Necropolis has a glowing eye that turns residents to stone when they meet its gaze, echoing the surveillance theme. Television broadcasts in the candy factory entrances workers into trances, suggesting the signal tower's influence extends even here. In the Carnevale, spotlights and stage lights possess the same hypnotic qualities as the Nowhere's characteristic illumination. The Institute's Hypnotist features giant eyes in the palms of his hands, literally embodying the concept of all-seeing observation. These recurring visual motifs tie the spiral's individual nightmares to the greater consciousness of the nowhere, suggesting that even as Lo experiences his personal hell, he remains under the watchful gaze of the realm's true master. Understanding the nowhere and the spiral's place within it provides essential context for interpreting the events of Little Nightmares 3. This is not simply a journey through scary locations, but rather a descent into the psychological landscape of a traumatized child, mediated through the nowhere's reality-warping properties. The spiral serves as the architecture of Lo's inner world, his fears and memories given physical form and connected through the mirrors that represent transitions between mental states, fragmented pieces of self that must be navigated to reach some semblance of escape or understanding. The question that hangs over the entire experience is whether escape is even possible, or if the nowhere simply releases different versions of the same trap, one nightmare trading places with another in an endless cycle of apparent freedom followed by renewed imprisonment. Lo, the imaginative boy. Lo serves as one of Little Nightmares 3's two protagonists, and in many ways the game's narrative centers more explicitly on his perspective than on Alone's, despite their equal importance in gameplay. He is introduced through official marketing materials as an imaginative boy, with an archer's eye and a firm belief that he knows a way to escape the nowhere. This description takes on layered meaning as the full scope of the game's narrative reveals itself, particularly the emphasis on Lo's imagination as a defining character trait. He appears to have lived in the spiral for an extended period, years rather than days or weeks, never losing hope in finding a way home despite the horrors that surround him. This persistent optimism in the face of overwhelming darkness characterizes Lo's approach to every challenge he encounters.
Physically, Lo presents as a short, scrawny, dark-skinned boy whose most distinctive feature is the white raven mask that conceals the upper portion of his face. According to the novel The Lonely Ones, a mask matching Lo's description was found backstage at the Carnevale's theater, described as white with a bird's beak, with one eye hole round while the other is smaller with a wink-like shape. This asymmetrical design gives the mask an unsettling appearance that suggests both vulnerability and watchfulness. The beak extends downward in a gentle curve, creating a visual that is simultaneously childlike in its simplicity and eerie in its death symbolism. Lo also wears a white fingerless glove on his left hand, with the sleeve extending up his arm, a dark blue cape that reaches the end of his shorts, and a beaded neon red and blue bracelet around his right ankle. His feet are bare. The mask's design carries symbolic weight that resonates throughout Little Nightmares 3's themes. Ravens and crows appear frequently in the Necropolis chapter, serving both as environmental elements and as sources of items that children need to progress. In various mythologies and cultural traditions, ravens serve as psychopomps, guides between worlds associated with death, transformation, and hidden knowledge. A child wearing a raven skull mask while navigating realms between reality and nightmare invokes these associations. The mask could represent Lo's attempt to adopt the qualities he perceives in these birds, the ability to see from above and beyond, to understand paths between worlds that others cannot perceive. Alternatively, the mask might represent a death of self, the persona Lo constructed to survive the nowhere, replacing or concealing whoever he was before his arrival. Interestingly, a mask matching Lo's description appears in the novel The Lonely Ones, which explores events at the Carnevale from a different perspective. In that story, a character named Roos discovers a white mask with a bird's beak backstage at the Carnevale's theater, one eye hole round and the other smaller with a wink-like shape. This suggests that Lo's mask may have originated within the spiral itself rather than being something he brought from the outside world, perhaps a costume piece from the Carnevale's collection that he claimed as his own. If this interpretation holds, it would mean that even Lo's most defining visual characteristic is something adopted from the nowhere rather than carried from his previous life, reinforcing the idea that the realm strips away or subsumes the identities of those who enter it. Lo's primary tool is a bow and arrow, a weapon that defines his gameplay role and carries its own symbolic resonance. The bow allows him to interact with the environment at range, shooting buttons, cutting ropes, activating mechanisms, and eliminating certain threats from a safe distance. Unlike Six's lighter or Mono's various melee weapons from previous games, Lo's bow grants him the ability to affect his environment without direct physical contact, maintaining space between himself and danger. This distance becomes a defining characteristic of how Lo engages with the world around him, preferring to solve problems from afar when possible, only engaging in close quarters when absolutely necessary. The choice of a bow as Lo's signature item connects to several thematic elements. Bows require patience, precision, and a steady hand to use effectively, qualities that Lo must develop to survive his journey. The act of shooting an arrow creates a momentary pause, a breath held before release that mirrors the careful, methodical approach required to navigate the spiral's dangers. Additionally, the bow's association with hunting and providing sustenance inverts into something more defensive in Lo's hands. He doesn't hunt for food or sport, but rather uses his weapon to create paths forward, to disable threats, and to protect both himself and alone from the creatures that stalk them. The bow becomes a tool of problem-solving rather than aggression, though it can certainly be turned to violent purposes when the situation demands. Throughout the game, Lo consults a piece of paper that he keeps with him constantly, initially appearing to be a map that guides the children through the spiral. In early trailers, gameplay footage, and screenshots, Lo can be seen looking at this paper between challenges, suggesting it plays an important role in their navigation. However, The game's ending reveals that this paper is not a map at all, but rather a drawing Lo created himself, a picture depicting him and Alone standing in front of a house, presumably the home he dreams of reaching. This revelation recontextualizes every scene where Lo consults the paper, transforming what seemed like practical navigation into something more poignant, a child clinging to a self-created image of the salvation he desperately wants to believe awaits him.
This detail about the drawing speaks to Lo's fundamental nature as someone who uses imagination to cope with and navigate trauma. Unable to bear the reality of his situation, trapped in what we eventually learn is the Institute, Lo constructed not just Alone as an imaginary companion, but an entire fantasy of escape, complete with a map that isn't a map, but rather a destination, a promise he made to himself that somewhere, somehow, there exists a place of safety. The fact that he discards this paper in frustration at one point in the Carnevale, when a mirror refuses to work as expected, only for Alone to retrieve it and return it to him, suggests that even within his own fantasy, Lo sometimes loses faith in the escape he imagines, requiring his created companion to remind him of the hope that keeps him moving forward. Lo's backstory gradually reveals itself through the flashback sequences that appear between chapters, and through environmental storytelling within the Institute. He spent considerable time in a room at the psychiatric facility, hiding from someone or something that would check on him periodically. The shadow that appears at the door in these flashbacks eventually reveals itself to be the Hypnotist, the Institute's monstrous overseer, suggesting that Lo's confinement was under the supervision of this creature who may have once been human. During his time in this room, Lo created numerous drawings, visual expressions of his inner world that he would hide in a trash chute whenever he heard someone approaching, desperate to keep his imagination private and protected from whatever psychological treatments the Institute might have inflicted upon it. Among these drawings and possessions in Lo's room, there existed a doll, a small figure wearing a green jumpsuit and aviator goggles, with ginger hair tied in pigtails. This doll served as Lo's constant companion during his isolation, the friend he talked to and played with when no other human connection was available to him. The game's final revelations establish that this doll is the true form of Alone, or rather, that Alone is the manifestation of this doll brought to life through Lo's imagination and the reality-warping properties of the Nowhere. Through unknown mechanisms, perhaps the same power that allows children to affect and shape the Nowhere, Lo's desperate need to not be alone in his suffering, combined with his naturally imaginative disposition, produced a companion who could accompany him through the nightmare landscape, someone who would never abandon him, never judge him, and always support his quest for escape. Alone represents everything Lo needed in a friend: loyal, brave, complementary to his skills, and completely dedicated to their shared goal. She is, in a very real sense, the ideal companion, constructed from Lo's deepest emotional requirements. The significance of Lo being the protagonist whose perspective we primarily follow cannot be understated when considering the themes and narrative structure of the game. While the cooperative gameplay creates mechanical parity between Lo and Alone, the story consistently frames experiences through Lo's eyes. The flashbacks are his memories. The Institute's personal spaces reveal his history. The final mirror scene shows his separation from Alone and his attempt to reunite with her. This focus suggests that Little Nightmares 3 is fundamentally Lo's story, with Alone serving as a crucial element of that story, but not possessing independent narrative agency in the same way she exists in relation to Lo's psychological needs, rather than as a fully autonomous character with her own separate motivations and history.
This revelation about Lo's nature as someone who created an imaginary friend to survive psychological trauma adds another layer to the Little Nightmares franchise's exploration of childhood coping mechanisms. Six's hunger in the first game could represent various forms of lack or need, manifesting as a consuming drive. Mono's transformation into the Thin Man in the second game creates a time loop that suggests escape from trauma is impossible. Lo's creation of Alone through imagination presents a different form of response to childhood suffering, the construction of an internal support system that allows continued functioning despite overwhelming circumstances. However, like the previous protagonist's coping mechanisms, Lo's imaginary friend ultimately proves insufficient for true escape, as the game's ending demonstrates when Alone cannot follow him out of the nowhere. Lo's firm belief that he knows a way to escape the nowhere, as described in his official character description, takes on a tragic dimension with the full context of his story. He does know a way out, in theory. The mirrors can serve as portals, and the window he sees in his dreams really does exist and does lead somewhere else. But his way out requires leaving Alone behind, and Lo's entire psychological architecture has been built around never being alone, around having this companion who makes survival bearable. The cruel irony of the game's conclusion is that Lo achieves the escape he sought, physically leaving the nowhere, but in doing so, he loses the one thing that made the journey survivable, leaving him alone in a different way, separated from the friend who helped him endure, but who cannot exist outside the nightmare space that gave her form. Alone, the imaginary companion. Alone serves as Little Nightmares 3's second protagonist, equal to Lo in gameplay importance, but occupying a fundamentally different role in the narrative's psychological framework. Her official description characterizes her simply as Lo's best friend, someone who has been with him ever since they found each other in this lonely nightmare. But this seemingly straightforward description conceals the game's central revelation about her true nature. She wears a lime-colored hazmat suit that covers most of her body, leaving only her hands and feet exposed, with 2 brass buttons on the collar and a zipper running down the middle fastened with a small green strap. The most distinctive element of her appearance is the aviator goggles perched atop her head, pushing back ginger hair styled in 2 pigtails that bounce as she moves through the spiral's treacherous environments. The hazmat suit carries its own symbolic weight within the context of Little Nightmares 3's themes. Hazmat suits serve as protection against hazardous materials, toxic environments, and contamination, creating a barrier between the wearer and a world that poses existential danger. For a child navigating the nowhere, a realm that corrupts and transforms anyone who stays too long, this protective clothing takes on literal significance. The suit suggests someone expecting to encounter poison, disease, or other forms of environmental threat, which accurately describes the spiral's various locations. However, the suit also creates distance, preventing direct contact with the world and other people, maintaining separation even in moments of connection. This visual metaphor reflects Alone's fundamental nature as a manifestation rather than a fully independent being, always maintaining a barrier between herself and true existence. The bright lime color of Alone's suit stands in stark contrast to the muted, decayed palette that dominates the nowhere. While Lo's raven mask at least fits the aesthetic of death and darkness that pervades these nightmare spaces, Alone's vibrant green creates visual dissonance, drawing the eye and standing out against every background.
This color choice serves practical gameplay purposes, making it easier for players to track both characters during cooperative play, and helping the AI-controlled companion remain visible during solo sessions. However, it also reinforces Alone's nature as something that doesn't quite belong in the nowhere, something inserted into these spaces rather than emerging from them organically. She is too bright, too clean, too distinct from the grimy, rust-stained world around her, which in retrospect serves as a visual hint toward the revelation about her origins.
Alone's primary tool is a wrench, a heavy metal implement that she wields with surprising strength for someone of her size. The wrench serves multiple functions throughout the game. It can smash through weakened walls and barriers, opening new paths forward. It can turn valves and bolts that require significant torque, activating machinery and mechanisms. It can be used as a weapon in certain situations, though, like Lowe's bow, direct combat remains a last resort rather than a primary approach. Most crucially, in terms of cooperative puzzle design, the wrench allows Alone to interact with industrial and mechanical elements that Lowe's bow cannot affect, creating scenarios where both characters must work together, with Lowe disabling distant obstacles while Alone manipulates closer mechanical systems. The choice of a wrench as Alone's signature item creates interesting parallels and contrasts with Lowe's bow. Where the bow emphasizes distance and precision, the wrench requires proximity and force. Where the bow operates through careful aim and released tension, the wrench demands direct application of physical strength. The wrench connects to themes of repair and maintenance, someone trying to fix broken systems and hold together infrastructure that's falling apart. In the context of Alone's true nature as a manifestation of Lowe's psychological needs, the wrench takes on additional symbolic meaning. She is the part of Lowe that engages directly with problems, that doesn't shy away from getting hands dirty, that approaches obstacles with straightforward application of force rather than clever maneuvering. She represents qualities that Lowe himself may lack or feel he lacks, making her the perfect complement to his more cautious, distant approach. Throughout the game, Alone displays personality traits that distinguish her from Lowe in subtle but important ways. She tends to be more physically brave, willing to charge into dangerous situations where Lowe might hesitate. In cutscenes and ambient animations, she often appears more energetic and eager, bouncing on her heels or gesturing enthusiastically when they discover something important. She retrieves Lowe's drawing when he discards it in frustration, demonstrating faith in their quest even when Lowe's own belief wavers. She never questions their journey or suggests alternative approaches, always supporting whatever direction Lowe chooses to pursue. These characteristics paint Alone as the ideal friend, someone whose personality perfectly meshes and supports Lowe's needs, someone who fills in the gaps in his emotional and practical capabilities without creating conflict or demanding attention for her own distinct desires. This perfection of companionship serves as another subtle hint toward Alone's true nature. Real people, even best friends, have moments of disagreement, different opinions, conflicting wants and needs that require negotiation and compromise. Alone never exhibits these qualities. She exists in a state of constant supportive agreement with Lowe, her desires perfectly aligned with his, her strengths precisely matched to compensate for his weaknesses. She is, in the truest sense, what Lowe would imagine the perfect friend to be, because that is exactly what she is. A construction of his imagination made manifest through the Nowhere's reality-warping properties and his own desperate need for companionship during his time in the Institute's isolation.
The shattering mirrors become particularly significant in light of the game's ending when Lowe successfully passes through the final mirror into what appears to be the real world, reaching a bedroom window from the outside and seeing his drawing's promised house before him.
He reaches back through the mirror to pull Alone after him, just as he has done throughout their entire journey, but this time the mirror violently rejects her, flinging her back into the nowhere as it shatters. The force of this rejection is noticeably stronger than the gentle shattering that occurred at previous mirror transitions, suggesting that while Alone could barely maintain existence within the spiral, a construct of the nowhere itself, she absolutely cannot exist outside of it. The nowhere gave her form, and outside its boundaries, she has no substance to maintain, no framework to support her manifestation. Another subtle hint appears in the way other creatures and monsters interact with Alone versus Low throughout the game. While both children face constant danger from the spiral's residents, careful observation reveals that enemies often seem to target Low more directly, with Alone serving as an auxiliary target or afterthought. This could be interpreted as simple gameplay balancing or AI behavior, ensuring that players controlling Low receive equal attention during encounters. However, in the context of Alone's true nature, it suggests that the monsters perceive something different about her, perhaps recognizing her as part of the nowhere itself, rather than an intruder who needs to be eliminated. She occupies a liminal space between the children who don't belong and the monstrous residents who do, neither fully one nor the other. The most emotionally devastating aspect of Alone's nature as Low's imaginary friend is what it reveals about Low's psychological state during his time in the Institute. Children typically develop imaginary friends during early childhood, usually between the ages of 3 and 7, as a normal part of cognitive and social development. However, the persistence of an imaginary friend beyond typical developmental stages, especially one who becomes crucial for functioning, often indicates significant trauma, social isolation, or emotional needs that aren't being met through real relationships. Low's creation of Alone suggests that his time in the Institute was so isolated, so devoid of genuine human connection and support, that he had to construct an entire person from his imagination just to survive psychologically. The doll that serves as Alone's physical anchor in the real world becomes a heartbreaking detail when considered in this light. Low took a simple toy, perhaps something given to him by the Institute staff or a possession he brought with him, and invested it with so much emotional significance that it became his primary relationship. He talked to it, confided in it, relied on it for comfort in a way that should have been provided by caring adults or peer friendships. The doll couldn't talk back, couldn't truly reciprocate, but in Low's imagination, fueled by desperation and the nowhere's ability to manifest belief as reality, it became Alone, a real companion who could share his burden and help him survive the nightmare he found himself trapped within. The name Alone itself carries obvious ironic weight. On the surface level, it appears to be simply a name, unusual perhaps, but no more so than many of the abstract or symbolic names that appear throughout the Little Nightmares franchise. However, once her true nature is revealed, the name transforms into a cruel statement of fact. Low is alone, has always been alone, despite his belief otherwise. He created Alone because he couldn't bear being alone, but her existence as a manifestation paradoxically emphasizes his isolation rather than alleviating it. The friend he made to keep him company was never truly there, could never truly fulfill the need that created her, because she wasn't separate from him, but rather an extension of his own fractured psyche. The game's title, Little Nightmares, takes on additional meaning through this lens. Alone herself is one of Low's nightmares, not in the sense of being frightening, but in the sense of being an unreal thing that seems real while in the grip of a dreaming or traumatized mind.
Alone's inability to leave the nowhere with Low creates the game's most poignant emotional moment. After everything they've survived together, after all the monsters they've fled from and puzzles they've solved, After Lo has guided them through the entire spiral toward the escape he promised existed, they finally reach the threshold. Lo makes it through. He's free. But when he reaches back for Alone, when he tries to pull her into the real world the same way he's pulled her through every mirror along their journey, she cannot follow. The mirror explodes with force, severing their connection and leaving Alone trapped in the nowhere, while Lo stands in freedom on the other side. This moment crystallizes the impossible tragedy at the heart of Lo's situation. His imaginary friend helped him survive, gave him strength and companionship through the worst isolation he's ever experienced, made it possible for him to keep going when giving up would have been easier. But that same imaginary friend, by her very nature, cannot transition into reality with him. Leaving the nowhere means leaving her behind. Growing beyond trauma, if that's what Lo's escape represents, requires abandoning the coping mechanisms that allowed survival of that trauma. Alone served her purpose, kept Lo functioning when he needed her most, but she cannot exist in a world beyond the nightmare that created her. She is fundamentally a symptom that must be left behind for healing to occur. The game doesn't show us what happens to Alone after the mirror shatters. We see her thrown back, see her hands reaching for Lo as the connection breaks, but we don't see where she ends up or what becomes of her. This ambiguity creates space for heartbreaking speculation. Does she continue to exist within the nowhere, now truly alone herself, wandering the spiral without the boy she was created to accompany? Does she cease to exist entirely, once separated from Lo? The belief and need that sustained her manifestation severed by the mirror's destruction. Does she revert to being just a doll again, lying somewhere in the ruins of the Institute, inanimate and forgotten? The game offers no answers, leaving players to imagine Alone's fate and confront their own feelings about what her loss means. Some players and theorists have suggested alternative interpretations of Alone's nature, arguing that she might be a real person who happened to bond with Lo in the Institute, or a ghost of a child who died there, or even another manifestation created by the nowhere itself rather than Lo specifically. However, the evidence strongly supports the imaginary friend interpretation. The doll in Lo's room matching Alone's appearance exactly, the flashback showing Lo clutching this doll for comfort, the mirror mechanics that treat her differently than Lo, the way she perfectly complements and supports his psychological needs without ever expressing conflicting desires, and most definitively, her violent rejection by the mirror when Lo tries to bring her into the real world. All of these elements align to confirm that Alone is Lo's creation rather than an independent entity. This revelation about Alone's nature fundamentally changes how players understand their entire journey through Little Nightmares 3. Every moment of cooperation between Lo and Alone becomes a visual representation of Lo working with and relying upon different aspects of his own psyche. Every puzzle solved through their combined efforts shows Lo utilizing both his careful, distant approach and the more direct, forceful method he imagined into existence through Alone. Every moment of companionship and mutual support is simultaneously real, in the sense that Lo genuinely found comfort and strength in Alone's presence, and false, in the sense that he was talking to himself the entire time, finding within his own imagination the friend he desperately needed but couldn't access in reality.
The tragedy of Alone extends beyond her individual fate to encompass what she represents for Lo's future. Having escaped the nowhere,
Lo now faces the real world without the coping mechanism that sustained him. He must learn to navigate reality without the imaginary friend who made the nightmare bearable. He must confront his trauma and isolation with only the psychological resources he actually possesses, not the idealized companion he constructed to fill the void. In some ways, this represents potential for genuine healing, the opportunity to form real relationships with real people who can offer genuine reciprocity and support. In other ways, it represents the loss of something precious and irreplaceable, a friend who may not have been real in the conventional sense, but whose impact on Lo's survival and emotional well-being was absolutely genuine. Alone stands as one of the most psychologically complex characters in the Little Nightmares franchise, despite, or perhaps because of her nature as a manifestation rather than a person. She embodies childhood resilience, the ability to create from imagination what reality fails to provide, while simultaneously representing the heartbreaking inadequacy of such solutions. She is both the evidence of Lo's strength, his ability to survive impossible isolation through sheer creative willpower, and the evidence of his suffering, the depths of abandonment that would drive a child to construct an entire person from wishes and a toy. She is the friend who saved Lo's life and the symptom that marks how badly he needed saving. She is alone. And through her, Lo discovers that being alone was always his true state, no matter how much he tried to imagine otherwise. Chapter 1. The Necropolis. The Necropolis serves as the opening chapter of Little Nightmares 3, introducing players to the core mechanics while establishing the unsettling atmosphere that will pervade the rest of the game. This ancient location immediately sets itself apart from the industrial and domestic spaces that dominated previous entries in the franchise, presenting instead a realm of dust, stone, and forgotten civilizations. The very name Necropolis translates from Greek as City of the Dead, and true to this designation, the location feels less like a place where people once lived and more like a monument to death itself, a massive cemetery or tomb complex where the architecture serves burial and commemoration rather than habitation. The necropolis sprawls across multiple environments, beginning in a vast desert waste where stone structures emerge from endless sand dunes under a sky that never quite achieves daylight. The color palette leans heavily into tans, grays, and faded earth tones, with occasional splashes of color provided by scattered fabrics and the disconcerting pink hues associated with the area's monsters. Wind constantly howls across the landscape, carrying sand that reduces visibility and creates an oppressive atmosphere of isolation. Despite the ostensibly outdoor setting, the space feels claustrophobic, with towering walls and cliffs boxing in the playable areas, suggesting that even in this open desert, escape remains impossible without finding the correct path forward. The architecture of the necropolis draws from multiple ancient cultural influences without directly replicating any single real-world civilization. Stone columns topped with carved capitals support crumbling structures. Intricate geometric patterns decorate walls and floors, their original meanings long forgotten. Statues depicting humanoid figures with exaggerated or distorted features watch over doorways and plazas, their blank stone eyes nevertheless creating the sensation of being observed. The buildings show clear signs of extreme age, with erosion, cracks, and collapsed sections suggesting centuries or millennia of abandonment. However, certain areas remain oddly preserved, as though time affects different portions of the necropolis according to inconsistent rules, another hint that this place exists outside normal reality.
As Lo and Alone navigate deeper into the necropolis, they discover that the ruins are actually not abandoned. The location houses a population of residents known as dwellers, humanoid creatures who inhabit the space but seen locked into strange patterns of behavior that suggest something between life and death. These dwellers wander the ruins in various states, some standing motionless as statues, others performing repetitive actions, all existing in what appears to be a kind of suspended animation or cursed half-life. Their dwellers, some bended portions of their bodies, arms or legs replaced with crude prosthetics, or simply absent entirely, yet they continue to function. Others show signs of extreme age or decomposition, with visible bones and deteriorating flesh, yet they don't collapse or cease moving. This impossible state of being, simultaneously dead and not dead, creates visceral discomfort, violating fundamental expectations about how bodies and death should work. Most dwellers appear locked into specific behaviors that they repeat endlessly. One might sweep the same spot on the floor over and over, the broom's motion never actually cleaning anything. Another stands at a window, gazing out at nothing, never turning away. A third walks a patrol route that serves no defensive purpose, circling the same small area without beginning or end. These repetitive actions suggest that the dwellers are trapped in some kind of psychic loop, forced to perform the last actions they took in life, or the duties they held before whatever catastrophe transformed them into their current state. They are not truly conscious or alive, but rather echoes of people, automated routines running in bodies that forgot how to stop. However, not all dwellers remain passive. When Lo and Alone enter certain spaces or trigger specific environmental elements, some dwellers activate, becoming hostile pursuers. These aggressive dwellers move with disturbing speed, given their deteriorated condition, sprinting after the children with single-minded determination. Their attacks, when they catch their prey, are brutal and swift, grabbing the children and crushing them or tearing them apart with surprising strength. The sudden shift from passive statue to deadly pursuer creates effective jump scares throughout the chapter, as players learn that any dweller they pass could potentially spring to life and give chase. The primary environmental mechanic of the Necropolis involves light and shadow, though not in the way players might expect from horror game convention. Here, darkness often provides safety, while certain light sources pose deadly danger. This inversion stems from the chapter's main monster, the Monster Baby, whose abilities fundamentally alter how players must navigate spaces. The dwellers, while dangerous, serve more as environmental obstacles and chase sequence threats rather than the chapter's true horror. That distinction belongs to the grotesque infant that lurks in the Necropolis's depths. Before encountering the Monster Baby directly, Lo and Alone must navigate through the Necropolis's various structures, solving environmental puzzles that establish the game's cooperative mechanics. Early puzzles tend toward straightforward designs, teaching players how the two characters' abilities complement each other. Lo might need to shoot an arrow at a distant button to open a gate, while Alone uses her wrench to turn a valve that extends a bridge. One character might need to stand on a pressure plate to hold a door open while the other passes through, then find an alternate route to reunite. These basic puzzles gradually increase in complexity, introducing elements like timed sequences, multiple stages, and environmental hazards that must be avoided while solving the core challenge.
The Necropolis features several distinct sub-areas that Lo and Alone progress through during the chapter. The opening desert section eventually gives way to partially buried buildings that the children must navigate, crawling through gaps in walls and squeezing between collapsed structures.
From there, they descend into underground chambers, tomb-like spaces lit by flickering torches or mysterious luminescent sources. A large plaza or courtyard serves as the setting for a significant chase sequence involving multiple dwellers. Eventually, the path leads to what appears to be a temple or palace, a more ornate structure, where the architecture becomes more elaborate and the puzzles more complex, culminating in the confrontation with the monster baby itself. Throughout the chapter, environmental storytelling provides glimpses into what the necropolis might have been before its current state. Scattered toys suggest that children once lived here, normal human children, rather than the cursed dwellers or the monster that now rules the ruins. Dolls, balls, and carved wooden animals lie forgotten in corners and beneath rubble, hints of ordinary life that once existed before whatever calamity befell this place. Drawings on walls depict scenes that might be mythological or historical, showing humanoid figures engaged in rituals or daily activities, though the exact meanings remain ambiguous. These environmental details paint a picture of a civilization that experienced some catastrophic event, transforming its population into the undead dwellers and birthing or summoning the monster baby that now haunts their ruins. The collectible dolls hidden throughout the necropolis, 5 in total for this chapter, require careful exploration and sometimes complex detours to obtain. These dolls match Lowe's physical appearance, small figures wearing raven masks, and their collection suggests a metatextual element where Lowe is finding representations of himself scattered through his own nightmare. The doll's locations often highlight areas of environmental detail that players might otherwise rush past, encouraging slower, more observant exploration of spaces that the main path doesn't require visiting. Finding all 5 dolls in the necropolis contributes to the overall completion percentage and potentially unlocks additional content, though the game doesn't explicitly reward collection with narrative revelations. The chapter's color palette and lighting design work together to create a sense of oppressive age and decay. Natural light, when it appears, comes through cracks and holes in walls or ceilings, casting dramatic shafts of illumination that create stark contrast with surrounding shadows. Artificial light sources, the torches and mysterious glowing elements scattered throughout, tend toward warm orange and yellow hues that emphasize the sandy, dusty environment. The monster baby's presence introduces sickly pink and purple tones, unnatural colors that signal danger and corruption. This careful use of color helps guide players spatially while reinforcing the emotional tenor of each area. Sound design in the necropolis emphasizes emptiness and age. Wind constantly whistles through gaps in the architecture, creating an ambient drone that never fully disappears. Footsteps echo differently depending on the surface, producing satisfying crunches on sand, sharp clicks on stone, and hollow thuds on wood. When dwellers activate, the sound of their movement changes dramatically, slow grinding and creaking replaced by rapid footfalls and guttural vocalizations that signal the shift from passive to aggressive. Music remains sparse, appearing primarily during chase sequences and major story moments, allowing the environmental audio to dominate and create a sense of lonely exploration.
The Necropolis establishes several thematic elements that will recur throughout Little Nightmares 3. The concept of things that should be dead continuing in mockery of life appears in every chapter, manifesting differently in each location. The emphasis on repetitive, purposeless behaviors reflects psychological trauma, minds locked into loops they cannot escape. The presence of children's items in spaces of death and decay reinforces the franchise's core concern with childhood innocence corrupted or destroyed by hostile environments. The monument to past civilizations, now reduced to haunted ruins, speaks to the inevitability of decline and the way history becomes nightmare when viewed through the lens of the present's fears.
As an opening chapter, the Necropolis succeeds in establishing Little Nightmares 3's mechanical foundation while introducing the game's psychological horror approach. The slower pace allows players to acclimate to controlling two characters cooperatively, whether working with another person or managing the AI companion. The gradual ramping of difficulty ensures that players develop competency with the core systems before facing the more intense challenges of later chapters. The environmental design demonstrates Supermassive Games' ability to create atmospheric spaces that feel distinct from Tarsier Studios' previous work, while maintaining the franchise's signature aesthetic of grotesque scale and unsettling detail. The Monster Baby. The Monster Baby stands as the Necropolis chapter's primary antagonist, a creature so disturbing in concept and execution that it immediately establishes Little Nightmares 3's willingness to embrace deeply uncomfortable imagery. According to official descriptions, she appears as a giant humanoid baby doll, wearing baby accessories like a frilled dress and a single shoe on one foot. Her head seems to be made of porcelain and appears extremely filthy and damaged, giving her the uncanny quality of something meant to represent innocence that has been corrupted beyond recognition. Similar to the bullies from Little Nightmares 2, her porcelain construction connects her to themes of fragility, childhood play, and objects that have taken on disturbing life. Her hair is ripped with little bits poking out around her head, adding to her decrepit appearance. The most distinctive and dangerous aspect of the Monster Baby is her right eye, which projects a petrifying light capable of turning living beings to stone. One eye appears partially closed, while the other remains wide open, emanating that deadly glow. This ability connects her to similar mechanics seen elsewhere in the franchise, such as the eyes in the prison chapter of The Maw and in The Nest from Very Little Nightmares. Her developers have noted that despite her atrocious actions, she may not act from malice, but rather from innocent curiosity, typical of a child, as she may not be fully aware of what she is doing. She enjoys searching for and playing with objects she finds around the city, including petrified figurines of her alleged victims and a giant bell she tears from a bell tower. When the Monster Baby's petrifying light touches any living creature, including the dwellers who populate the Necropolis, it triggers an immediate and horrifying transformation. The victim's body begins to petrify after enough exposure, hardening into stone. The petrification appears agonizing based on the contorted positions of petrified dwellers found throughout the chapter, their stone bodies frozen in poses suggesting attempted flight or shielding gestures. Interestingly,
Evidence suggests that she only turns victims to stone on the outside, as some petrified dwellers have their internal organs still visible beneath the stone shell. Once fully petrified, victims remain as statues indefinitely, adding to the necropolis's population of stone figures that blur the line between deliberate monuments and cursed residents. For Low and Alone, contact with the monster baby's petrifying gaze means death, requiring a restart from the last checkpoint. This creates high-stakes gameplay during monster baby encounters, where players must remain constantly aware of the creature's position and the direction of her gaze, using environmental cover to break line of sight and prevent the deadly light from reaching them. The monster baby's movements are described as dangerous precisely because of her size, clumsiness, and curiosity, combined with her immense strength. She is capable of breaking through buildings and tearing away obstacles with ease. Her attention quickly shifts to other things the moment she notices any movement or sounds, not just from inanimate objects, but also from smaller living beings and animals such as the flock of crows she occasionally playfully chases. The combination of recognizable baby behavior and destructive capability creates cognitive dissonance that amplifies the creature's horror. She is by far the largest free-roaming antagonist seen in the franchise thus far, excluding living structures like the signal tower, capable of towering over buildings.
The game introduces the monster baby gradually, building tension before the first full encounter. Players initially see evidence of its passage, the trails dragged through sand by its massive body, the petrified dwellers frozen in terror, the distant sounds of something large moving through adjacent chambers. The first actual sighting often comes as a controlled reveal, where Low and Alone peek through a gap or from around a corner to witness the monster baby in a separate space, allowing players to observe its behavior without immediate danger. This technique, showing the threat before forcing interaction with it, builds dread and gives players information they'll need to survive the coming encounters. The primary monster baby sequences in the Necropolis typically involve stealth and timing-based puzzles, where players must navigate spaces while avoiding the creature's searching gaze. Cover becomes essential, with players ducking behind pillars, walls, and other large objects when the I-beam sweeps in their direction. The monster baby often moves in patterns, turning its head and upper body to scan areas systematically, creating windows of opportunity when its attention focuses elsewhere. Successful navigation requires observing these patterns, identifying safe moments to move, and ensuring both characters reach cover before the beam completes its rotation and sweeps back across the space. Some sequences escalate to chase scenarios, where the monster baby actively pursues Low and Alone after detecting their presence. These chases transform the methodical stealth gameplay into frantic scrambling, with players sprinting through corridors while the creature crashes through the environment behind them. The monster baby's large size allows it to burst through certain walls and obstacles that would stop the children, creating the impression that nowhere is truly safe once it begins active pursuit. These chase sequences typically end when players reach a specific environmental trigger, such as activating a mechanism that causes rubble to fall and block the monster baby's path, or passing through a doorway too small for it to follow, creating a moment of relief as the threat is temporarily neutralized. The defeat or escape from the monster baby doesn't come through direct confrontation, as befits Little Nightmare's philosophy that children cannot fight monsters on equal terms.
Instead, players must use environmental elements to distract or evade her. Throughout the chapter, she can be lured by sounds like ringing bells, which she finds curious enough to investigate. In one notable sequence, Lo and Alone must ring a giant bell to draw her attention, then hide while she takes the bell with her, inadvertently creating a path forward. Her curiosity becomes both a danger and a tool for the children's survival. While she doesn't appear to die in any conventional sense, she is eventually distracted or evaded long enough for Lo and Alone to reach the mirror at the end of the chapter and escape to the candy factory. The monster baby's design draws from several sources of childhood fear and discomfort. The corruption of infant imagery taps into the uncanny valley effect, where something that should be innocent and helpless becomes threatening through slight wrongness. Babies already occupy an uncomfortable space in horror media, as their helplessness and incomprehension create natural empathy. But when these same characteristics appear in a threatening entity, they create confused emotional responses that amplify dread. The petrification ability specifically invokes themes of being frozen, paralyzed, rendered helpless, which connects to common nightmares about being unable to move or escape from threats.
In the context of Little Nightmares 3's larger narrative and Lo's psychological journey, the monster baby takes on additional symbolic significance. If the entire spiral represents Lo's inner world, his fears and traumas manifested as environmental nightmares, then the monster baby likely corresponds to something from his experience. The Necropolis's themes of death, preservation of things that should be gone, and trapped existence mirror the psychological state of someone institutionalized, held in suspended animation rather than allowed to truly live or die. The monster baby, an infant that should represent new life and potential, but instead brings stasis and death, could symbolize Lo's own arrested development, the way trauma and institutionalization prevented him from progressing normally through childhood stages. The petrification ability specifically relates to the sensation of being watched and judged, where observation itself causes harm and transformation. This mirrors the experience of being in a psychiatric facility where staff constantly monitor patients, where privacy disappears and every action occurs under scrutiny. The dwellers, trapped in endless repetition of meaningless actions, echo the institutionalized routine where days blur together without progress or purpose. The monster baby, roaming these ruins and turning anything that moves into frozen statues, represents the threat that any deviation from prescribed behavior will result in punishment, in being frozen or locked down, in losing what little agency and autonomy one possesses. The monster baby also functions within Little Nightmares' broader mythology of grotesque distortions. Previous games featured the guests, adults transformed by insatiable hunger into corpulent horrors, the patients, hospital occupants twisted into shambling threats, and the viewers, city residents mesmerized by screens into zombie-like states. The monster baby continues this tradition of taking human or human-adjacent forms and distorting them into monsters through exaggeration of specific characteristics or behaviors. The infant form, typically associated with complete innocence and vulnerability, becomes monstrous through size, power, and the perversion of what an infant's gaze should represent. Wonder and curiosity replaced with petrifying judgment. Some players and theorists have speculated about the monster baby's origins within the Necropolis. Did this creature exist before the civilization that built these ruins fell?
perhaps as a deity or supernatural entity they worshipped? Did it emerge from the catastrophe that transformed the residents into dwellers, birthed from collective trauma or cursed energy? Is it a child who was transformed by the nowhere, similar to how various games suggest that prolonged exposure to this realm corrupts and changes everyone who remains too long? The game provides no definitive answers, maintaining the ambiguity that characterizes Little Nightmares' approach to lore, where suggestion and implication outweigh explicit explanation. What remains certain is that the monster baby serves its mechanical and thematic purposes effectively. As a gameplay antagonist, it provides appropriately challenging encounters that teach players the stealth and evasion skills they'll need in later chapters. As a horror element, it delivers memorable discomfort through its disturbing design and petrification ability. As a thematic component, it embodies the Necropolis's concerns with death, preservation, observation, and the corruption of innocence. And, as a potential symbol within Lowe's psychological landscape, it represents the institutional forces that sought to render him static and docile, turning a living child into something more like a statue, immobile and silent, existing rather than living. Chapter 2: The Candy Factory. Following their escape from the Necropolis through a shattering mirror, Lowe and Alone emerge into the Candy Factory, a location that represents a dramatic shift in aesthetic and theme while maintaining the oppressive atmosphere that defines Little Nightmares. If the Necropolis embraced ancient stone and dust, the Candy Factory presents an industrial nightmare of metal, machinery, and mass production. The location's name promises sweetness and childhood delight, evoking images of confectionery wonderlands, but the reality delivers something far more sinister. A place where the creation of candy has become a nightmarish process that consumes everything in its path, transforming innocent desires into industrial horror.
The Candy Factory's visual design leans heavily into retro-industrial aesthetics, evoking early 20th century manufacturing facilities with their emphasis on visible machinery, exposed pipes, and functional rather than decorative architecture. The color palette shifts dramatically from the Necropolis's earth tones to a combination of industrial browns, chemical greens, and the garish pinks of candy products in various stages of production. Machinery dominates every space, with conveyor belts carrying products through different stages of processing, massive vats bubbling with substances, packaging equipment wrapping and sealing finished goods with mechanical precision. The scale of everything, as is standard for Little Nightmares environments, dwarfs Lowe and Alone, emphasizing their vulnerability and the industrial process's indifference to small, fragile things like children. The Candy Factory introduces a terrifying antagonist called the Supervisor, described in official materials as the factory's imposing authority figure whose eternal vigilance can't make up for the gradual decline of an inert workforce. She is a monstrous older woman who sports 6 different arms, giving her a spider-like quality. Her face is heavily wrinkled and warped, featuring a constant grin with 2 large buck teeth and wide eyes. Her attire consists of a long blue dress with 6 long sleeves, reaching to each of her elbows, and a black belt at her waist. A round purple beaded necklace wraps tightly around her neck, along with matching round purple earrings. Each of her fingers sports a purple nail. Game files sometimes refer to her as Candy Ma'am, hinting at the twisted maternal authority she represents.
At the beginning of the level, the supervisor presents herself as a diligent, competent manager. The immense number of filing cabinets and tape recordings she is seen organizing indicates that she is very meticulous and thorough in supervising and archiving the factory's operations. However, when she becomes frustrated, her professional demeanor transforms dramatically. Unlatching herself from her dress, she begins to walk on her 6 arms in a spider-like manner, all while screaming loudly. In this wrathful state, she demonstrates several animal-like traits and a very short temper, quickly climbing up walls and slipping through tight spaces with ease. When hunting the protagonists, she behaves similarly to a bloodhound, chasing them with feral rage in an unyielding pursuit. The factory also houses workers called the Herd, humanoid figures Lowen alone encounter throughout their exploration. These workers present as adults dressed in stained work clothes and wearing masks that obscure their faces. However, these workers have clearly been transformed or corrupted by their environment. They move in shambling, zombie-like patterns, performing their assigned tasks with mechanical repetition, regardless of whether those tasks serve any productive purpose. Some can be seen dangling from overhead conveyors, while others sort boxes on shelves or perform other repetitive labor. The Herd also appears in the Carnevale chapter, suggesting they may be common throughout the spiral. The Herd members appear hypnotized or mentally absent, their movements suggesting automation rather than conscious choice. This connects to broader Little Nightmares themes about adults transformed by their environments and obsessions. They don't initially register Low and Alone as primary threats, but their presence creates environmental danger. In some sections, luring Herd members into danger or using them to destroy obstacles becomes an advantageous strategy, though the children must then escape before they can be caught. The factory also features security cameras that monitor the facility, and shutting these down by disconnecting the security feeds becomes a key objective that enrages the supervisor when accomplished.
The candy factory introduces environmental hazards tied to the production process itself, creating danger from machinery and materials, in addition to the creature threats. Conveyor belts can carry Low or Alone into crushing mechanisms, grinding wheels, or boiling vats if players don't time their crossing carefully. Pistons slam down at regular intervals, requiring players to dash past during safe windows or be flattened. Chemical spillage creates pools of toxic liquid that damage the children on contact, forcing careful navigation around these hazards. Packaging machines can trap the children in boxes or wrapping if they're caught in the wrong position when the machines cycle. These environmental threats combine with monster encounters to create multi-layered danger, where players must track both hostile creatures and deadly machinery simultaneously. Puzzles in the candy factory often incorporate the location's industrial machinery into their solutions. Low might need to shoot targets to activate conveyor belts at specific moments, creating platforms for Alone to cross otherwise impassable gaps. Alone's wrench becomes essential for operating valves that redirect pipes, draining toxic pools, or filling vats to create new paths. Players must sometimes manipulate production machinery to create specific items or configurations, such as causing a machine to produce oversized candy pieces that can be pushed to activate pressure plates. The cooperative nature of these puzzles becomes more complex than in the Necropolis, requiring better timing, coordination, and more intricate sequencing of actions between the two characters. One particularly memorable sequence involves Low and Alone navigating a massive warehouse filled with finished candy products, stacked in precarious arrangements. The supervisor patrols this area, its height allowing it to spot the children even when they hide behind boxes and containers.
Players must create a path forward by pushing boxes to form stairs and bridges while timing movements to avoid the supervisor's searching gaze. The sequence culminates in causing a cascade of boxes to fall, temporarily trapping the supervisor and allowing escape. But the collapsing boxes create their own hazard, as players must flee the avalanche of candy containers that threatens to bury them. Another significant set piece takes place in the boiling room, where enormous vats of liquid candy bubble at dangerous temperatures. The supervisor corners Low and Alone in this area, forcing them to navigate across narrow catwalks and precarious platforms suspended above the deadly vats. The heat from the boiling liquid creates visual distortion effects and an oppressive atmosphere, while steam periodically vents from pipes, obscuring visibility and creating moments of panic as players temporarily lose sight of the pursuing supervisor. The sequence requires precise platforming and coordination, as one character may need to operate machinery to extend platforms while the other stays ahead of the supervisor. Then the roles reverse as environmental configurations change. The Candy Factory chapter also prominently features candy weevils, small insectoid creatures that have infested the factory's products and materials. These bugs swarm in dark areas and can only be deterred by light sources. Players must carry glowing batteries or fuses that create a protective glow, keeping the weevils at bay while navigating infested sections. However, companions must stay within the light's radius, as straying too far allows the bugs to swarm and attack. The weevils add environmental puzzle elements, requiring players to manage light sources while progressing through dark areas. The climactic confrontation with the supervisor occurs after Low and Alone disable the security cameras, which enrages her to the point of separating her upper body from her lower prosthetic half to pursue them in a spider-like manner. The final chase leads to a pressing machine, where the children must lure the supervisor onto the mechanism and activate it at the right moment. When both characters pull the switch, the hydraulic press crushes her, making her one of the only antagonists in the game who definitively dies. After her defeat, Low and Alone make their way through the rest of the factory until they find another mirror to escape, transitioning to the Carnevale.
Thematically, the Candy Factory explores childhood desires corrupted by mass production and adult systems. Candy represents one of the quintessential childhood pleasures, simple sweetness that brings uncomplicated joy. However, the factory's industrial process strips away any magic or delight, revealing candy production as just another form of manufacturing, mechanical, cold, and prioritizing efficiency over quality or joy. The location suggests how adult systems and institutions take things meant to bring children happiness and transform them into commoditized products, robbing them of meaning in the process of scaling them for mass consumption. The herd's zombified workers represent adults consumed by labor, their humanity worn away by repetitive work until they become more machine than person. This connects to fears about industrialization and dehumanization, where workers are valued only for their productive capacity rather than their personhood. The factory continues operating despite having no clear purpose or destination for its products, mirroring the way systems often perpetuate themselves long after their original justification has disappeared, continuing through sheer institutional momentum rather than any conscious choice. In the context of Low's psychological journey, if the spiral represents his inner world, the Candy Factory might symbolize several aspects of his experience. The transformation of something sweet and desirable into something toxic and threatening could represent how promises of treatment or help at the Institute proved to be lies, where what seemed like care was actually something harmful. The supervisor's relentless oversight mirrors the constant surveillance of institutional life, where privacy disappears and authority figures monitor every action. The herd's mindless repetition of tasks echoes the rigid routines and schedules imposed in psychiatric facilities, where days blur together in structured sameness that grinds away individuality and agency. The Candy Factory chapter successfully builds on the foundation established by the Necropolis, while introducing new mechanical complexity and aesthetic variety. The shift from ancient ruins to industrial nightmare demonstrates the spiral's diversity and the range of fears and traumas it encompasses. The supervisor and the herd provide distinct threat types that require different player responses, encouraging adaptation and learning. The increased emphasis on machinery and environmental hazards adds complexity to puzzle design and navigation, and the thematic resonance of corrupted sweetness and dehumanized labor enriches the game's broader exploration of how childhood innocence is destroyed by uncaring systems and hostile environments. Chapter 3: The Carnevale. The Carnevale represents Little Nightmares 3's longest and most elaborate chapter, approximately doubling the length of the Necropolis and Candy Factory combined. This sprawling location presents a nightmarish carnival or circus environment aboard a giant wooden airship floating high in the sky, with clouds visible throughout and the constant swaying of the ship creating a sense of instability. The setting transforms entertainment and celebration into sources of dread and horror. The Carnevale is described as an old, run-down funfair filled with stalls, stands, wagons, and twisting towers curving inward, with the herd crowding its grounds. The very concept of a carnival naturally invokes childhood experiences, making the Carnevale's corruption particularly effective as nightmare fuel. The airship itself represents remarkable design, a massive wooden structure that somehow remains aloft, featuring giant wooden masts, wooden floors, and multiple lower decks to explore. The vessel's construction suggests constant repair and modification rather than deliberate design, and the ever-present sound of creaking wood reinforces the impression that the entire structure exists in precarious balance. Poles are constructed around the fair, decorated with hanging props and connected with bright string lights that, like most light sources in the nowhere, can cause hypnotic effects on anyone who stares at them too long. The chapter features multiple antagonist types. The puppets appear as small, child-sized humanoid residents who work at the Carnevale and attack low and alone on sight. These puppet creatures can be defeated by using Lowe's bow to shoot off their heads, after which Alone can smash the detached heads with her wrench before the puppets can recover. Some puppets may be sleeping and can be snuck past, adding stealth elements to the puppet encounters. The primary antagonists of the Carnevale's second half are the kin and mini-kin, who capture children and force them to perform circus acts. The kin, also known as the man in the purple suit, appears as a slender humanoid with a disproportionately large head and a small patch of hair on top. He wears a purple suit that sags over his body and a red bow tie. In his right hand is the mini-kin, a small dummy-like humanoid that can detach from his arm to pursue prey independently.
The kin is shown to be cruel, especially towards the herd, with his domain surrounded by their corpses. At one point, Lo and Alone witness him snapping the neck of a gnome cowering in a corner. He is one of the few residents who doesn't make noise after noticing children, calmly walking toward them when alerted, which makes him particularly unnerving. Near the end of the Carnevale chapter, he uses a shotgun similar to the hunter's weapon from Little Nightmares 2, making him the second antagonist in the series to use a firearm. Minikin appears as a smaller man that sits on the lap of the kin, and the only features detailed are the hair on top of his lumpy face, where a wide mouth has been carved out. Unlike the kin, Minikin has eyes, both bloodshot, with his left eye seemingly stuck up in its socket. He has a long nose that reaches his mouth. In gameplay, Minikin behaves like a rabid dog, chasing after the protagonists with agility on his two hands. His canine-like personality is further emphasized when begging the kin for food, putting a dog bowl in his mouth and banning it on a table. Minikin feeds on the flesh of dead herd members that the kin amputates and feeds to him. The pair escape the kin and Minikin's lair in a hot air balloon, setting fire to Minikin with the balloon's burner before floating away. However, the balloon is struck by lightning and crashes, leading to another of Lo's memory flashbacks, where he hides his drawings from the shadow figure and discovers a doll that resembles Alone. This crash transitions Lo and Alone to the shores of the Institute for the final chapter. The Carnevale also features familiar elements for series veterans, including gnomes that can be hugged and provide assistance, the Vault of Curiosities, a storage space in the deepest lower decks, contains many egg esters referencing characters and objects from the previous two games. The location also features a giant Ferris wheel, a big-top circus tent where children are forced to perform, and a carousel featuring mounts primarily consisting of insects, amphibians, and arthropods. The chapter contains 10 collectible dolls and 10 geisha statues that reference the lady from the first Little Nightmares game, whose presence connects the Carnevale to the broader franchise mythology.
Thematically, the Carnevale explores multiple concepts relevant to childhood experience and trauma. The Carnevale setting represents entertainment and joy, but the location reveals these as performances, artificial constructs maintained through effort rather than genuine feeling. The kin's painted faces, forever smiling or frowning regardless of circumstance, suggest emotional suppression, being forced to display appropriate expressions rather than authentic feelings. The puppet's constant performance, despite the absence of an audience, mirrors the exhausting requirement to maintain appearances and meet expectations even when no one truly cares or pays attention. The television presence and hypnotic broadcasts connect to themes of control through entertainment, how media and performances can pacify and manipulate, creating docile consumers who accept what they're shown rather than questioning or resisting. The Hall of Mirrors suggests distorted self-perception, seeing oneself as monstrous or wrong because that's the reflection provided by external judgment. The backstage areas revealing mundane mechanisms behind magical performances speaks to disillusionment, learning that wonder and joy are manufactured products rather than spontaneous experiences. In Lo's psychological context, the Carnevale might represent several aspects of his institutional experience.
Psychiatric facilities often emphasize appearing well-adjusted and performing normalcy to satisfy staff and earn privileges or eventual release. Patients learn to display appropriate emotions and behaviors regardless of their actual internal states, becoming performers in a show where the audience holds power over their freedom. Group therapy and recreational activities might feel like forced celebrations, mandatory participation in joy that feels anything but joyful. The constant observation and judgment creates a panopticon effect, where everyone becomes both performer and audience, never able to simply exist without evaluation. The Carnevale chapter succeeds in creating the game's most visually and mechanically complex environment, justifying its extended length through constant variety in challenges, monster types, and environmental scenarios. The colorful yet horrifying aesthetic creates memorable imagery that stands alongside the series' best location designs. The multiple antagonist types provide continual fresh challenges, preventing the chapter from feeling repetitive despite its length. And the thematic richness offers layers of interpretation that reward analysis and reflection beyond simple gameplay progression. Chapter 4: The Institute. The Institute serves as Little Nightmares 3's final chapter, and the location where all narrative threads converge into their devastating revelation. Where previous chapters maintained some ambiguity about Lowe's past and the nature of his journey, the Institute removes the veil, revealing this sterile clinical facility as the real-world location from which Lowe's entire psychological odyssey originated. The chapter's opening moments with Lowe and Alone emerging from the mirror into institutional corridors create immediate dissonance. These hallways feel less stylized than previous locations, more grounded in recognizable reality, despite the Nowhere's corrupting influence. The transition from the Carnevale's garish excess to the Institute's stark minimalism emphasizes the shift from external nightmares to internal confrontation.
The Institute presents as a psychiatric facility designed for children, evident from the small furniture, educational materials, and recreational items scattered throughout. However, the design philosophy leans heavily toward control and observation rather than care and comfort. Long corridors allow clear sightlines for monitoring patients. Rooms feature minimal furniture and no objects that could serve as weapons or tools for self-harm. Windows, where they exist, are either barred or positioned too high for children to reach. Doors lock from the outside rather than inside, ensuring that staff controls access rather than patients choosing isolation or socialization. The color scheme emphasizes sterile whites and institutional greens, occasionally punctuated by faded primary colors in recreational areas, where attempts at cheerfulness only emphasize the underlying coldness. The Institute exists in a state of decay that suggests long abandonment, though certain sections appear to shift between ruined and pristine states throughout the chapter. In ruined form, the facility shows years of neglect, with water damage staining walls, mold creeping across surfaces, furniture overturned or broken, and vegetation somehow finding purchase in cracks and corners despite the indoor environment. In pristine form, the Institute appears as it might have during active operation, clean, organized, with lights functioning and equipment in working order. This shifting between states creates temporal disorientation,
suggesting that Lo is experiencing multiple time periods simultaneously, or that memory is overlaying current reality. The mechanism driving these shifts becomes clear when Lo discovers and retrieves a special doll hidden within the Institute, the same doll shown in his flashback sequences, the physical representation of Alone. When Lo holds this doll, the Institute transforms around him, ruined sections becoming pristine, locked doors opening, and previously impassable barriers disappearing. This mechanic forms the core of many puzzles in the chapter, where players must figure out when to hold or set down the doll to create the environmental configuration needed to progress. The doll's power to reshape reality represents Lo's psychological state, his grip on the comforting fiction of Alone's existence, allowing him to navigate spaces that would otherwise be too traumatic or impossible to traverse. Alone remains present throughout the Institute chapter, accompanying Lo as she has throughout the entire game. However, her role becomes increasingly complicated as the chapter progresses and players begin to suspect or realize her true nature. In pristine areas, Alone appears solid and normal. In ruined sections, particularly when Lo isn't holding the doll, she sometimes becomes translucent or flickers, visual hints at her status as manifestation rather than physical being. The game doesn't explicitly point out these changes, leaving players to notice them organically, creating growing unease about Alone's reality. The Institute houses its own monstrous threats, with the primary antagonist being the Hypnotist, a giant resident whose body snakes around the entire Institute building. According to official descriptions, he is a giant monster with long limbs that seem to stretch through the whole facility. His face almost appears to be melting, with sagging flesh drooping off his skull, a heavily wrinkled forehead, and a turned-down lip. His eyes are white with no pupils, and he wears glasses to help him see. Each of his large hands has a single giant eye in the palm, which serve as his primary sensory organs. His feet remain bare, and his fingers appear almost sausage-like. Portraits found around the Institute show the Hypnotist used to be smaller, like most other residents in the Nowhere. In his former appearance, he had a round head with wrinkles on his forehead, retained his glasses, and wore a blue shirt with a yellow tie and detachable suspenders. Game files for these portraits include the word counselor, which may connect him to Otto, the counselor character from the Sounds of Nightmares podcast, who also worked at a psychiatric institute. The shadowy figure who appears at the door in Lo's flashback memories is heavily implied to be the Hypnotist in his role as someone who would check on patients.
Due to his immense size, the Hypnotist's maneuverability is limited. He can only appear a few limbs at a time, showing his face and both arms only if a room is large enough, but never his entire body at once. He normally uses his hands to blindly feel around the environment, only occasionally using the eyes located in his palms to better assess situations. If his hands can't do the job, he will eventually peer into a room with his face. He is very aggressive, actively pursuing Lo and Alone through the ruined Institute multiple times after being awakened by them. The Hypnotist's first appearance in the game occurs early in the Institute chapter when Lo and Alone's pathway is blocked by what appears to be the body of a giant snake. When Alone hits a nearby gong with her wrench enough times, it is revealed that the thing blocking their path was actually a giant leg belonging to the Hypnotist, which he withdraws.
The sound of gongs becomes a key mechanic for stunning or affecting the hypnotist throughout the chapter. His presence creates multiple chase sequences and encounters that test players' ability to evade and ultimately defeat him. The Institute also features nurses as secondary threats, humanoid creatures who work at the facility. Unlike the hypnotist, the nurses are blind, having dark holes instead of eyes. However, they navigate extremely well by sound, so players must remain quiet in their presence and can distract them by breaking bottles or creating noise elsewhere. The nurses wear traditional uniforms stained with various substances, and their silent movement on soft-soled shoes creates situations where players suddenly realize a nurse is nearby only after nearly stumbling into one. Avoiding detection requires careful timing and sound management rather than simply staying out of sight. A third enemy type appears in certain sections of the Institute, carnivorous plants that have somehow infiltrated the building, breaking through walls and floors to spread throughout certain wings. These plants react to movement and proximity, lashing out with tendril-like appendages to grab or strike at low and alone when they venture too close. Unlike the humanoid monsters, plants function more as environmental hazards, stationary threats that control space rather than mobile pursuers. Their presence adds puzzle elements as players must find ways to navigate around or through areas covered by their vines and reach mechanisms to progress. Environmental storytelling in the Institute provides the most direct information about Lowe's past of any location in Little Nightmares 3. Room 1331, which matches Lowe's patient number based on a bed found with those same numbers, contains personal items suggesting Lowe's time at the county's Psychiatric Institute. Drawings cover walls and tables, and players can find the chute where Lowe would hide his artwork from the shadow that checked on him. The discovery of the alone doll in this room, which emits a warm, illuminating light, becomes central to understanding both Alone's nature and Lowe's psychological state during his institutionalization. Common areas reveal more about the facility's operations and philosophy. A cafeteria holds long tables where patients ate communal meals under staff supervision. A recreation room contains activities meant to occupy children, board games, art supplies, and a television that connects to the broader mythology of the Nowhere's screen-based influence. Therapy rooms feature chairs positioned for doctor-patient conversations, along with equipment whose exact purpose remains ambiguous, but suggests various treatment modalities. An isolation room, padded walls, and a locked door speaks to the facility's darker practices, the use of solitary confinement as punishment or control method for children deemed too disruptive.
Offices and staff areas provide glimpses into the institutional perspective on the children they treated. Files, rendered as visual documents that players can't directly read, but whose forms and layouts suggest patient records, sit in cabinets and on desks. Medication logs track dispensing of various drugs, the names obscured, but the frequency and dosage amounts suggesting heavily medicated patient populations. Notes and memos between staff members, their content conveyed through context and occasional legible words, hint at disagreements over treatment approaches and concerns about certain practices. These materials paint a picture of an institution that perhaps began with good intentions, but devolved into something more concerned with control and compliance than genuine care or healing. One particularly devastating environmental detail comes in Lowe's personal room, where players can find his drawings hidden in the trash chute, exactly as shown in the flashback sequences.
These drawings depict Lo and Alone in various scenarios, adventures together, facing monsters, reaching the house from his map drawing. Seeing these images confirms that Alone has existed in Lo's imagination throughout his institutionalization, that she predates the journey through the spiral rather than being created by it. The drawings also show increasing desperation in their execution. Earlier ones more detailed and hopeful, later ones rushed and crude, suggesting Lo's deteriorating mental state over time as the isolation and treatment wore away at his resilience. The doll itself, Alone's physical form, becomes central to both gameplay and narrative in the Institute chapter. When Lo holds the doll, the environment transforms to pristine state, and Alone remains solid and present. When he sets it down to solve puzzles or navigate obstacles, the ruins return, and Alone sometimes flickers or fades. This mechanical necessity, there are situations where Lo must set down the doll to progress, forces players to repeatedly enact the abandonment of Alone, creating emotional discomfort that mirrors Lo's own psychological conflict between clinging to his coping mechanism and confronting reality. Puzzles in the Institute often involve manipulating the pristine, ruined states to create paths forward. A collapsed floor in ruined state becomes intact when Lo holds the doll, allowing crossing, but a door might only be unlocked in ruined state, requiring Lo to set the doll down temporarily. Some sequences require Alone to remain in a different state than Lo, with her existing in pristine form while he navigates ruined environments, or vice versa, creating spatial puzzles where the two characters occupy different versions of the same space simultaneously. These reality-bending challenges reflect Lo's fractured psyche, his mind existing in multiple temporal and psychological states at once. The climactic boss fight against the Hypnotist occurs after Lo and Alone reach the final mirror, but are prevented from using it. The battle consists of multiple phases where players must dodge falling debris while waiting for gongs to appear. Hitting the gongs with Alone's wrench stuns the Hypnotist and exposes the eyes in his palms, which Lo must then shoot with his bow. In the first phase, players remove wooden boards from a fallen gong, strike it, then shoot the exposed eye on his right hand. The second phase involves the Hypnotist's other hand, requiring the same strategy. Finally, his head appears in the arena, where Alone must smash his glasses with her wrench before Lo delivers the final blow by shooting him in the eye. The pain causes the Hypnotist to scream and destroy the entire floor, making all three of them fall into the abyss below. After Lo and Alone awaken from the fall, the Hypnotist's final appearance shows him on the ground, unconscious and unresponsive, with his hands still twitching under the rubble of the collapsed Institute. Whether he is truly dead or merely defeated remains ambiguous. The path to the final mirror is now clear, leading to the game's emotional conclusion.
The game's ending delivers its central revelation. Lo approaches the final mirror and steps through successfully, arriving in what appears to be the real world outside a building, with a window visible and the house from his drawing in the distance. When he reaches back through the mirror to pull Alone after him, as he has done at every previous mirror, she cannot follow. The mirror violently rejects her, and she is thrown back into the nowhere. According to sources covering the ending, without Lo there to act as her anchor of existence, she fades into nothingness, leaving only her outfit, goggles, and the drawing from Lo behind. The mirror shatters completely, severing the connection between Lo and his imaginary friend forever. The post-credits scene deepens the emotional impact.
It shows Lo in what appears to be a small room resembling the one from his dreams, sitting beside the broken mirror and desperately trying to piece it back together. This suggests that while Lo may have physically escaped, he is emotionally broken by the loss of his only friend and is not ready to accept reality. He hopes to fix the mirror so he can be reunited with Alone. The scene implies that Lo's nightmare may not truly be over, that he remains psychologically trapped, even if physically free. Thematically, the Institute chapter operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Most obviously, it explores the trauma of institutionalization, particularly childhood psychiatric institutionalization, where children are removed from families and normal environments, placed in facilities that prioritize control over care, subjected to treatments that may cause more harm than healing, and denied agency over their own lives and bodies. Lo's creation of Alone represents a survival strategy born from desperate need, his imagination constructing what reality would not provide. The hypnosis embodies the invasive nature of psychiatric authority, entering minds and attempting to reshape thoughts and behaviors according to institutional goals rather than the patient's actual needs. The pristine, ruined state shifting suggests dissociation and the way trauma fractures perception of time and reality. Someone experiencing severe psychological distress might simultaneously occupy multiple temporal states, remembering the past as if it's present, experiencing the present as if it's already past, unable to maintain stable relationship with the current moment. Lo's experience of the Institute as both abandoned ruin and functioning facility reflects this fractured temporality, his mind unable to settle on a single coherent narrative about what happened and is happening to him. The chapter also explores themes of imagination as both salvation and prison. Lo's imaginary friend gave him strength to endure isolation that might otherwise have broken him entirely. Alone's presence made survival possible, provided companionship and support when none existed in reality. However, this same coping mechanism became a barrier to true escape, as Lo couldn't leave the nowhere while maintaining the fiction of Alone's existence. Healing requires abandoning survival strategies that no longer serve, even when those strategies are precious and their loss feels like further trauma. The Institute chapter successfully brings Little Nightmares 3's narrative to its emotional climax while maintaining the gameplay challenge and environmental puzzle solving that defines the series. The revelation about Alone's nature recontextualizes the entire journey without invalidating player experience or emotional investment. The Hypnotist provides a final memorable monster encounter with unique mechanics, and the environmental design grounds the fantastical elements of previous chapters in a recognizable, real-world horror that hits differently than the stylized nightmares of the Necropolis, Candy Factory, and Carnevale.
The ending and its meaning. Little Nightmares 3's ending represents one of the most psychologically complex conclusions in the franchise's history, trading the twisted time loops and dark transformations of previous games for a quieter but no less devastating exploration of loss, growth, and the impossible price of escape. It's important to note that unlike Little Nightmares 2, which featured two different endings, Little Nightmares 3 has only one canonical ending, regardless of collectibles gathered or choices made. The developers appear to have chosen this linear approach to emphasize the emotional weight of the story's conclusion. The mirror's explosive rejection of Alone operates on multiple interpretive levels. On the most literal level, based on what the game shows us, Alone cannot leave the nowhere because the realm gave her physical form in the first place.
She was real inside the nightmare, a manifestation brought to life through Lo's imagination and the Nowhere's reality-warping properties, but she could not exist in the real world. The final mirror appears to act as a filter, separating reality from illusion. Some players interpret this as meaning she simply had nowhere to go outside the nowhere, as she was never truly real in the conventional sense. The character names themselves provide clues to this interpretation. Lo suggests someone at their lowest point, trapped and traumatized. Alone could represent the literal personification of that feeling of being alone, the manifestation of Lo's loneliness given form. From this perspective, alone represents the strength, skill, and companionship Lo needed to survive. The entire cooperative gameplay mechanic becomes, in retrospect, a representation of a traumatized child working with his own will to survive, different aspects of his psyche collaborating to navigate the nightmare landscape. The house that Lo sees in the distance, matching the drawing he carried throughout his journey, raises questions about what his escape actually achieves. Game files surrounding the dilapidated room in the ending are marked counties, suggesting a connection to the county's psychiatric institute. But whether the final location represents the real world or another layer of the nowhere remains deliberately ambiguous. Some elements of the ending environment seem lighter and more vibrant than the nowhere's murky gray hues, but there's also something ethereal about it that has led some players to question whether Lo has truly escaped or simply entered a new phase of his nightmare. Some players interpret the ending as genuinely hopeful, despite its sadness. In this reading, Lo has broken free from both the nowhere and the Institute, escaped into the real world where he can begin building an actual life. The loss of Alone, while heartbreaking, could represent necessary growth. He must learn to form real relationships with real people, rather than relying on an imaginary companion. The house in the distance promises a future, maybe not perfect or free from difficulty, but real in a way his time in the spiral never was. Other players read the ending more darkly, noting that the Nowhere has demonstrated throughout the franchise its ability to offer false escapes that turn into new prisons. 6 apparently escapes the maw, only for Little Nightmares 2 to suggest that her freedom leads to darker places. Mono tries to save 6, only to be betrayed and transformed into the very monster he was fleeing. Based on this pattern, some theorize that Lo's escape through the mirror could be another illusion, the Nowhere creating the appearance of freedom while actually maintaining its hold. The broken mirror and Lo's continued obsession with piecing it back together could indicate that his journey is far from over. A third interpretation suggests that the ending is simultaneously both escape and continued imprisonment, reflecting the reality that trauma recovery is never complete or final. Lo may physically leave the Institute and the Nowhere, but the psychological scars remain. He carries the memories of everything he experienced, both the real traumas of institutionalization and the nightmares of the spiral. He can never fully return to who he was before these events, as they fundamentally changed him. Alone is gone, but her absence is itself a presence, a hole in his psyche where she used to reside. He's free, but forever marked, escaped, but never entirely away from what he escaped.
The game's refusal to show what happens after the mirror shatters beyond that single image of separation is crucial to its emotional impact. By not resolving Lo's story definitively, the game leaves space for player interpretation and emotional processing. Different people will understand the ending according to their own experiences with trauma, institutional care, mental illness, and recovery. Someone who has successfully navigated therapy and built healthy coping strategies might see hope in Lo's willingness to leave alone behind. Someone still struggling with their own psychological wounds might identify with the pain of that loss and question whether escape was worth the cost. Alone's fate in particular provokes strong emotional responses and ongoing fan discussion. What happens to her after the mirror explodes? Does she continue to exist within the nowhere, now truly alone as her name suggests, wandering the spiral without the boy she was created to accompany? Does she cease to exist entirely, once separated from Lo, the belief and need that sustained her manifestation severed by the mirror's destruction? Does she revert to being just a doll, lying somewhere in the ruined institute, inanimate and forgotten? Or does she remain trapped in that moment, eternally reaching toward a mirror that no longer exists, frozen in the instant of separation? The game provides no answers, and this absence of closure serves the narrative's themes. Alone was created by Lo's need, and her ultimate fate is whatever Lo believes it to be. If he carries guilt about abandoning her, she might persist in his mind as an accusing presence, a representation of the coping strategies he had to sacrifice for growth. If he makes peace with leaving her behind, she might fade into memory, a bittersweet reminder of a time when imagination was the only tool available for survival. If he never fully recovers or remains in a liminal psychological state, she might continue to exist in some form, a half-presence felt but never seen, the ghost of an imaginary friend haunting the boundary between illness and health. The ending also invites consideration of what the entire journey through the spiral was for. If Alone wasn't real, and Lo was likely physically in the Institute the entire time, does that mean none of it happened? This question misunderstands the nature of psychological experience. For Lo, everything was real in the sense that he experienced it, felt it, survived it. The Necropolis's dwellers and monster baby, the candy factory's supervisor and herd, the Carnevale's kin and puppets, the Institute's hypnotist and nurses, all of these threats represented real psychological dangers, even if they never existed as physical entities. The puzzles Lo solved, the challenges he overcame, the companionship he shared with Alone, all of these held meaning and consequence for his internal development, even if they never manifested in the external world. This raises profound questions about the relationship between reality and experience, particularly in the context of mental illness and trauma. Are hallucinations, delusions, or dissociative experiences less real because they don't correspond to external objective reality? The person experiencing them certainly can't dismiss them as unreal while in their grip. The emotions felt during these states, the terror, confusion, desperation, hope, relief, are genuine emotions with genuine psychological impact. Lo's journey through the spiral, whether it happened in any objective sense, shaped him and his development in ways that will persist regardless of its ontological status. The ending also comments on the nature of growing up and leaving childhood behind. Imaginary friends are developmentally normal for young children and typically fade naturally as children develop stronger social connections and more sophisticated coping strategies. However, when trauma severely disrupts development,
Children may cling to imaginary companions long past typical ages, unable to progress to later developmental stages while still stuck in the psychological state that required the imaginary friend's support. Lowe's separation from Alone can be read as finally completing this developmental progression, releasing the childhood survival strategy so that adolescent or adult functioning can emerge.
This reading adds poignancy to Alone's loss. She didn't fail Lowe or become unnecessary because she was inadequate. Rather, she succeeded so completely in helping him survive that he finally grew strong enough to function without her. Her entire purpose was to keep Lowe alive and functional until he could manage on his own, and by achieving that goal, she made herself obsolete. It's a bittersweet success, where the best possible outcome still requires saying goodbye to something precious and irreplaceable, acknowledging that growth sometimes feels like loss, even when it's ultimately positive. Some players have noted similarities between Little Nightmares 3's ending and other media exploring imaginary friends and childhood psychology. The revelation that a companion wasn't real appears in various stories, from Fight Club to A Beautiful Mind to Drop Dead Fred. However, Little Nightmares 3 distinguishes itself by maintaining sympathy for both the creation of the imaginary friend and the necessity of separation. The game never suggests that Lowe was weak or broken for creating Alone, nor does it frame her as simply a symptom to be eliminated. Instead, it honors her role in his survival, while acknowledging that survival strategies and healing strategies are not always the same thing. The ending's emotional impact is amplified by the cooperative gameplay that preceded it. Players spent the entire game working with Alone, whether as a second player or as an AI companion. They relied on her abilities, coordinated puzzles with her, shared triumphs and setbacks. The relationship between Lowe and Alone wasn't just narrative, it was mechanical, built into the fundamental way players experience the game. Her removal at the end thus feels personal in a way that purely narrative losses might not, as players have developed their own relationship with her through gameplay, rather than simply observing Lowe's relationship with her through cutscenes. For players who experience the game in online co-op, the ending takes on additional dimensions. The person controlling Alone spent hours embodying this character, making decisions and taking actions as her. The revelation that Alone isn't real might feel like a betrayal, discovering that the character they invested in lacks the autonomous existence they assumed. Alternatively, it might recontextualize the entire co-op experience as a metaphor for Lowe's internal dialogue, the back and forth between players representing Lowe's mind working through problems by consulting different aspects of his psyche represented as separate entities. The game's final image, Lowe on one side of the shattered mirror frame, Alone on the other, both reaching but unable to touch, captures in visual form the central tragedy of psychological growth through trauma. Moving forward requires leaving things behind, but the things we must leave are often the very things that helped us survive long enough to move forward at all. This creates impossible situations where every choice carries loss, where progress and grief become inseparable. Lowe gains his escape, but loses his friend. He achieves freedom, but at the cost of the companionship that made captivity bearable. He survives, but only by abandoning part of himself. Little Nightmares 3's ending stands as one of the franchise's most ambitious narrative swings. eschewing the supernatural horror of time loops and monstrous transformations for psychological horror rooted in real experiences of institutional trauma and childhood survival strategies. The revelation about Alone's nature could have felt like a cheap twist, but the game's careful foreshadowing through mirror mechanics and environmental storytelling ensures that attentive players can anticipate the truth even as they might hope against it. The emotional weight of the separation lands effectively because the game earned player investment in Lo and Alone's relationship through genuine cooperative gameplay and consistent characterization. Whether players find the ending hopeful, tragic, or ambiguously somewhere between depends largely on what they bring to the interpretation. Someone who has experienced successful recovery from trauma might see Lo's escape as genuine and ultimately positive despite the necessary loss. Someone still in the midst of their own struggles might identify more with the pain of separation and uncertainty about whether escape is even possible. Someone who approaches the game primarily as a horror experience might appreciate the ambiguity that leaves open the possibility of continued nightmare. All these readings are valid because the ending was crafted to support multiple interpretations, respecting the complexity of the psychological themes it engages with.
Themes and symbolism throughout Little Nightmares 3. Little Nightmares 3 operates on multiple thematic levels simultaneously, weaving together concerns about childhood trauma, institutional abuse, imagination as both salvation and prison, observation and performance, and the fundamental question of what it means to escape when the prison is psychological rather than physical. These themes manifest through the game's locations, monsters, mechanics, and narrative, creating a cohesive artistic statement about the nature of suffering and survival in childhood. The most pervasive theme throughout Little Nightmares 3 is the corruption of things meant to bring children joy or care. The Necropolis, while not explicitly a children's space, contains toys and child-sized areas, suggesting it once housed young people in something other than the cursed half-life its current dweller residents endure. The Candy Factory transforms sweets, quintessential childhood pleasures, into industrial horror, divorced from any sense of joy or delight. The Carnevale corrupts entertainment and celebration into forced performance and hollow spectacle. The Hypnotist's palm-mounted eyes make observation its primary weapon, seeing into and controlling minds through the act of looking. This emphasis on being watched connects to institutional experiences where privacy disappears and constant monitoring becomes a form of violation and control. The game's cooperative gameplay mechanics support themes about internal dialogue and psychological fragmentation. Lo and Alone's need to work together, combining their different abilities and approaches to solve problems, mirrors the way healthy psychological functioning requires integrating different aspects of self into coherent wholes. Lo's distant, precise approach with the bow represents careful analytical thinking. Alone's direct, forceful approach with the wrench represents more immediate, action-oriented problem-solving. Both are necessary, and neither is sufficient alone. In the context of Alone being Lo's creation, their cooperation represents Lo's ability to access and utilize different parts of his own psyche, drawing on various cognitive and emotional resources to navigate challenges. Mirrors recur throughout Little Nightmares 3 as symbols of self-perception, boundaries between states, and the relationship between reality and reflection. Lo's ability to see through mirrors to other locations suggests insight or awareness beyond normal perception.
The shattering that occurs each time Alone passes through mirrors hints at her unstable relationship with boundaries and definitions. The final mirror's violent rejection of Alone when Lo tries to pull her into the real world represents the ultimate boundary between manifestation and physical existence, between psychological survival strategies and actual recovery. Mirrors also connect to broader franchise themes about identity and transformation, how the selves we see reflected might not match who we actually are, and how confronting our reflections can reveal uncomfortable truths.
The game's use of scale, a franchise hallmark, carries thematic weight beyond simple visual impact. The overwhelming size of monsters and environments emphasizes childhood powerlessness, the experience of being small in a world controlled by incomprehensibly large forces. Lo and Alone cannot fight the Supervisor, Monster Baby, or Hypnotist directly. They can only evade, hide, and occasionally use the environment to their advantage. This reflects real children's experiences in institutional settings, where adult authority figures exercise nearly total control, and children's agency is severely limited. The puzzle solving that allows progress despite this powerlessness represents the ways children find to exert agency even in highly controlled environments, using creativity and cooperation to achieve goals that direct action cannot accomplish. Repetition appears as a motif throughout the game, from the dweller's endless loops to the herd's purposeless labor to the Carnevale's eternal performances. This repetition symbolizes the way trauma creates psychological loops where the same patterns play out endlessly, where escape seems impossible because every path leads back to the same place. Breaking these loops requires external intervention or internal breakthrough, which Lo achieves through his journey and ultimate choice to release Alone. The repetition also reflects institutional routine, where days blur into indistinguishable sameness, with no meaningful progress or change despite the passage of time. The transformation of humans into monsters serves as perhaps the franchise's most consistent theme, and Little Nightmares 3 continues this tradition while adding nuance. The dwellers appear to be people cursed into undead states. The herd seems to be workers consumed by their labor. The Carnevale's kin might be performers locked into eternal shows. The Institute's nurses likely were once actual medical staff. These transformations suggest that the Nowhere doesn't create its monsters from nothing, but rather warps and corrupts existing people, amplifying certain characteristics or obsessions until humanity is lost. This connects to fears about losing oneself to circumstances, about becoming the thing you're trapped with, about how environments and experiences can fundamentally alter who we are. Color symbolism operates throughout Little Nightmares 3 in ways both subtle and overt. The Necropolis's muted earth tones represent age, decay, and the weight of history. The Candy Factory's garish artificial colors suggest toxic sweetness and chemical corruption. The Carnevale's saturated primaries emphasize forced cheerfulness and performed joy. The Institute's sterile whites and institutional greens evoke clinical coldness and medical horror. Lowe's Raven mask provides black and white simplicity against these complex palettes, while Alone's bright lime hazmat suit stands out in every environment, literally not fitting into any of these spaces, which retrospectively reinforces her status as an inserted element rather than something that belongs organically to the nowhere. Food and consumption appear as recurring elements with symbolic weight. The candy factory's industrial production of sweets connects to commercialization and the way childhood desires are commodified and exploited. The absence of food or normal sustenance in other chapters suggests deprivation and unmet needs. Previous Little Nightmares games made hunger central to their narratives, with Six's consuming appetite driving much of her journey. Little Nightmares 3 largely removes food as a central concern, possibly reflecting that Lowe's needs are psychological rather than physical, that what he's starving for cannot be satisfied through conventional nourishment. Light and darkness function differently in Little Nightmares 3 than in traditional horror games. Darkness often provides safety, allowing Lowe and Alone to hide from threats that hunt by sight. Certain light sources pose danger, like the monster baby's petrifying gaze or the hypnotic beams in the Institute. This inversion suggests that exposure and visibility create vulnerability, that being seen means being controlled or harmed. The metaphorical resonance for childhood trauma is clear. Visibility to abusers or authority figures makes one vulnerable to their power, while obscurity offers protection, even as it enforces isolation.
The game's approach to violence and death remains consistent with franchise precedent: brutal, sudden, and uncompromising. Lowe and Alone can die in numerous horrifying ways: crushed, grabbed, petrified, injected, consumed, torn apart. These deaths never become sanitized or softened, maintaining the stakes and emphasizing vulnerability. However, the game never lingers on death sequences or revels in gore for its own sake. Death serves mechanical purposes, teaching players what to avoid and motivating careful play, while thematically reinforcing how dangerous the world is for these children, how death waits at every mistake. The absence of dialogue or traditional narrative exposition forces environmental storytelling to carry thematic weight. Players must interpret spaces, objects, and monster behaviors to construct understanding rather than having themes explicitly stated. This approach respects player intelligence, while also creating space for multiple valid interpretations. Different players will emphasize different aspects of the environmental storytelling based on their own experiences and concerns, finding themes that resonate personally while potentially overlooking elements that others find central. Ultimately, Little Nightmares 3's themes coalesce around questions of survival and cost. What do children sacrifice to survive hostile environments? What coping mechanisms do they develop, and what happens when those mechanisms must be abandoned for growth to continue? How do imagination and dissociation serve survival, while also potentially preventing full engagement with reality? What does escape mean when the prison is internal, constructed from psychological necessity rather than external walls? These questions don't have simple answers, which is precisely why Little Nightmares 3 explores them through horror game mechanics and surreal imagery rather than attempting direct, literal engagement.
The game suggests that survival itself is a form of victory, even when the methods of survival carry their own costs and complications. Lo created alone because he needed her to continue functioning. This was not weakness, but resourcefulness, using the tools available to him, his imagination and the Nowhere's reality-warping properties, to construct what external reality refused to provide. That this solution proved temporary, that growth eventually required leaving it behind, doesn't negate its necessity at the time. The game honors childhood survival strategies while acknowledging their limitations, a nuanced approach that respects the complexity of trauma and recovery. Secrets of the Spiral DLC and future content. Bandai Namco's announcement of the Secrets of the Spiral expansion pass indicates that Little Nightmares 3's story is not finished, with 2 additional chapters planned for release over the course of 2026. While specific details remain scarce at the time of this writing, the expansion's title suggests it will explore areas of the spiral not visited in the base game, potentially revealing new information about this region of the Nowhere and possibly providing additional context for Lo and Alone's journey or the fates of other children trapped in similar nightmares. The first chapter of Secrets of the Spiral is scheduled to release between April and June 2026, approximately 6 to 8 months after the base game's launch. This timing allows Supermassive Games substantial development time to create content that, hopefully, addresses some criticisms leveled at the base game, while expanding the universe in meaningful ways. Based on typical expansion structures for narrative horror games, this first chapter will likely be substantial, perhaps comparable in length to the Candy Factory or Necropolis chapters, featuring a new location within the spiral with its own distinct aesthetic, monsters, and mechanical gimmicks.
Speculation about what this first expansion chapter might contain centers on several possibilities, given the base game's narrative structure and themes. Since the DLC is confirmed to feature co-op play, a return of Lo and Alone seems highly likely, according to fan speculation, though Supermassive Games hasn't revealed specific details about the story content. One theory suggests the expansion might explore what happened to Alone after the mirror shattered, potentially following her perspective or showing how she continues to exist within the Nowhere. This would provide narrative closure for players who felt devastated by her fate, while potentially revealing new information about how the Nowhere treats entities born from imagination. Another possibility is that the expansion chapters explore entirely different children trapped in the spiral, showing how other victims of the Nowhere experience this region. The novel The Lonely Ones already establishes that Lo and Alone are not the only children to traverse the Carnevale, suggesting a larger population of trapped souls navigating these nightmare spaces. Following different protagonists could allow Supermassive Games to explore new gameplay dynamics while expanding the lore without needing to directly continue or contradict Lo and Alone's story. A third theory proposes that the expansion might function as content exploring the origins of the locations themselves or events that occurred before Lo's journey. How did the Necropolis come to house the monster baby? What caused the Candy Factory workers to transform into the herd? When did the Carnevale's performers become trapped in their current state? What happened at the Institute before its decay? Answering these questions could provide satisfying context while avoiding the narrative complications of continuing past the base game's ending. The expansion's availability structure provides interesting insight into Bandai Namco's approach to post-launch monetization.
Secrets of the Spiral can be purchased separately from the base game, allowing players to buy only the content they want. Alternatively, players can purchase the Deluxe Edition, which includes the base game, both expansion chapters, and several cosmetic costume sets, including the Ferryman costume set and the Residence costumes pack. Pre-orders also provided access to the Dark Six costume set, which dresses both Low and Alone in outfits inspired by Six's iconic yellow raincoat from the first game. These costume options, while purely cosmetic and not affecting gameplay, carry thematic weight when considered in relation to the game's narrative. Dressing Low and Alone as characters from previous games emphasizes their place within the broader franchise mythology, suggesting that despite the new development team and different storytelling approach, Little Nightmares 3 remains fundamentally connected to what came before. The expansion's title, Secrets of the Spiral, explicitly promises revelations and hidden information about this region of the Nowhere. This framing raises expectations that the DLC will provide substantial lore expansion rather than simply offering more gameplay challenges in similar environments. Players anticipating the expansion expect to learn more about the Spiral's nature, its relationship to other Nowhere locations, and possibly the mechanisms by which it draws children into its grasp. The expansion represents a significant test for Supermassive Games' stewardship of the Little Nightmares franchise. While the base game demonstrated their ability to create atmospheric horror spaces and maintain the series' distinctive visual style, it also drew criticism for certain aspects of the experience. Secrets of the Spiral provides an opportunity to address feedback and prove that their vision for the franchise can stand alongside Tarsier Studios' original work. For players who loved Little Nightmares 3, the expansion promises more of what worked: additional time in the Spiral's unsettling environments, fresh horrors to evade, fresh puzzles to solve cooperatively, and potentially additional narrative context. For players who found the base game disappointing, the expansion represents either a chance to be won over or a decision point about whether to continue engaging with the franchise under its new development team. For newcomers to the series, the expansion continues to build out the Nowhere's mythology in ways that could deepen appreciation for the broader franchise.
Ultimately, Secrets of the Spiral's success will be measured not just by reception, but by whether it contributes meaningfully to the Little Nightmares universe and the broader conversation about childhood trauma, imagination, and survival that the franchise has engaged with since its inception. Conclusion. Little Nightmares 3 represents both a continuation of and a departure from the franchise that Tarsier Studios established across the first two games and their various expansions. Under Supermassive Games development, the series maintains its distinctive visual style, atmospheric horror, and exploration of childhood fears through nightmare logic and grotesque imagery. However, the introduction of cooperative gameplay as a core feature and the psychological revelation about Alone's nature as Low's imaginary friend mark significant evolutions in the franchise's approach to interactive horror storytelling. The game's four main chapters, the Necropolis, Candy Factory, Carnevale, and Institute, each contribute distinct aesthetic and thematic elements, while building toward the emotional crescendo of Low and Alone's separation at the mirror. The journey through these locations functions as both a literal escape attempt and what appears to be a psychological navigation of Low's inner world, shaped by his experiences at the County Psychiatric Institute. The monsters that populate these spaces, from the monster baby's petrifying gaze to the hypnotist's searching hands, externalize various forms of threat that children in vulnerable situations might experience. Low and Alone themselves stand as memorable additions to the Little Nightmares roster of protagonists,
their dynamic offering something distinct from Six's lone struggle or Mono's doomed attempt to save Six from the signal tower. The cooperative nature of their journey, whether experienced with another player or with AI companion, creates mechanical investment that amplifies the emotional impact when their separation reveals Alone's true nature. Lo's imagination sustained him through unbearable circumstances, but ultimately, escaping appears to require leaving that coping mechanism behind, creating a conclusion that refuses easy categorization as either happy or tragic. The mixed reception from critics and players reflects both the challenge of continuing a beloved franchise under new development and the inherent difficulty of evolving a formula while maintaining what made it special. Some players embraced the cooperative innovation and psychological focus, while others missed elements that characterized earlier entries. These varying reactions demonstrate that horror, particularly horror engaging with psychological themes, affects different people differently based on their experiences and expectations. The upcoming Secrets of the Spiral expansion offers opportunities to expand the game's universe and provide additional context for the base game's events. Whether the expansion will focus on Lo and Alone specifically or explore the spiral through other perspectives remains to be seen, but either approach could enrich the overall experience and demonstrate Supermassive Games' commitment to the franchise's potential. Little Nightmares 3 asks players to confront questions about childhood, trauma, imagination, and recovery. It suggests that survival itself is an achievement worth honoring even when the methods of survival carry costs. It acknowledges that growing beyond difficult experiences may require leaving behind the very things that made survival possible. And it maintains ambiguity about whether escape from psychological prisons is ever truly complete, leaving players to draw their own conclusions about what Lo's journey ultimately means.
As you've journeyed with me through this exploration of Little Nightmares 3's lore, from the dust-choked Necropolis to the clinical corridors of the Institute, from Lo's first steps into the spiral to his final separation from Alone at the Shattered Mirror, I hope you've gained a deeper appreciation for the game's complexity and the themes it engages with. Whether you experienced Little Nightmares 3 firsthand or discovered its story through this telling, the nightmare Lo endured and the friend he had to leave behind offer a mirror reflecting questions about loss, growth, and the impossible choices that difficult circumstances sometimes demand. The spiral continues to turn somewhere in the depths of the nowhere, potentially drawing new victims into its embrace, reflecting their fears back at them through fog and shadow. And in the real world, children face institutions and systems that sometimes fail them in ways both subtle and profound, creating experiences that shape them for years to come, requiring survival strategies that must eventually be addressed for growth to continue. If you've enjoyed this deep exploration into Little Nightmares 3's complete lore, I'd appreciate it if you'd take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more horror game lore told in this relaxed, immersive style. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Little Nightmares 3's ending, whether you found it hopeful or tragic, and what you hope to see in the Secrets of the Spiral expansion. Share your own interpretations and theories, as horror stories gain richness through the multiple perspectives we bring to them. Until next time, may your own nightmares be little, and may you find companions, real or imagined, to help you through the darkest paths. Sleep well, travelers, and remember that even in the deepest fog, mirrors can show the way forward, even if the reflection isn't always what we hoped to see. Good night.